Welcome back to the Quiet Apothecary. Settle in wherever you are tonight. Let your shoulders come down from around your ears, and let the day you have just finished begin, very slowly, to loosen its hold on you. There is nothing here that needs doing, and nowhere else you are meant to be. Tonight we are not going to the apothecary's shop with its rows of blue and white jars, nor to the walled physic garden behind the monastery, nor even to the wise woman's cottage at the edge of the parish. Tonight we are going somewhere far more ordinary than any of those. We are going into an ordinary home, the kind that stood in its thousands across medieval Europe, and we are going to look, slowly and without hurry, at the one small store of medicine that every such house kept somewhere within its walls. There was no chemist to hurry to in the dark. There was no cabinet of neat labeled bottles. What there was, instead, was a shelf, or a crock kept warm by the hearth, a bundle of dried leaves hanging from a beam, a jug of vinegar in the cool of the larder, a little box of seeds, a pot of soft fat set near the fire. Scattered through the house, in the places a family passed a dozen times a day, lay everything it had to meet a fever, a burn, a cough, a wound, or a long and frightening night. Tonight we are going to take that whole quiet store down, shelf by shelf and jar by jar, and see what was really in it. We will move slowly, one thing at a time, the way you might tidy a familiar cupboard by candlelight, with no reason at all to rush. There is no need to remember any of this. Not a single name, not a single remedy. Let the words come and go as they please. If your eyes close somewhere between the honey and the herb bundles, that was always the point of the evening, and you will have missed nothing at all. Let us begin where the household itself began each day, at the hearth and the small shelf that stood beside it. The heart of the medieval house was the fire. In a cottage it was the whole of the house, a single low room with the hearth in the middle or against one wall, and everything the family owned arranged in the warmth and the light it gave off. Near that fire, within easy reach of the woman who tended it, there was almost always a shelf. Sometimes it was a proper board fixed to the wall, sometimes only a plank laid across two pegs, sometimes the flat top of a chest or the deep sill of the one small window. Whatever its shape, this was the place where the things most often needed lived, and a good half of those things were medicine, as much as they were anything else. You would find on it the crock of honey and the jug of vinegar we will come to shortly, a pot of rendered fat for salves, a little dish of salt, perhaps a horn cup, and a wooden spoon kept for the sick, and whatever dried herb was most in use that season. Nothing on the shelf was rare, nothing was expensive. It was, in the truest sense, a household store, gathered slowly across the year from the garden and the hedgerow and the market, kept close to the fire so that a remedy could be warmed and given without anyone having to leave the room where the sick person lay. It is worth pausing, before we take anything down, on what this shelf really was. It was the first physician the household ever consulted, and very often the only one. A day's walk might lie between an ordinary village and the nearest trained doctor, and the doctor's fee, when he could be reached at all, was silver that a cottage family simply did not have. So when a child woke in the night burning with fever, or a man came in from the field with a gash across his hand, no one thought first of sending for help. They thought first of the shelf. What was on it, and what could be made from it? was the difference between a bad night got through and a bad night that turned to something worse. The keeper of the shelf was, almost always, the woman of the house. The good wife, as she was called across much of England, held in her head the whole of what the shelf could do, learned not from any book, but from her own mother and grandmother, tested and corrected across a lifetime of small illnesses. She knew which crock held what, how old each thing was, how much of it was left, and when it would need making again. She knew, without ever writing it down, the particular smell of honey that had begun to turn, the look of a salve gone rancid, the point at which a dried herb had lost its virtue and should be thrown to the fire and gathered fresh. This quiet, unwritten stocktaking, carried entirely in memory, was one of the countless small skills that kept a medieval household alive. There were no labels on any of it. Most of the people who kept these stores could neither read nor write, and even where they could, there was little need. The shelf was known the way your own kitchen is known to you in the dark, by the order of things, by the shape and weight of a particular jar, by long habit. A stranger looking at it might have seen only a jumble of crocks and bundles. The woman who kept it could have found any one of them blindfolded, and told you at a touch how much was inside and how long it had been there. Picture the shelf itself for a moment, since we will be standing before it for much of the night. It sits a little above the reach of the smallest child, close enough to the fire that everything on it stays dry and just faintly warm. The crocks are earthenware, glazed brown or grey, some stopped with a twist of cloth, some with a wooden lid, some with a bladder tied down over the mouth. Bundles of dried herb hang from the beam above, so that a fine dust of them drifts down whenever the door is slammed. The whole shelf smells, always, of the same layered things: honey and beeswax and dried mint, wood smoke and tallow and old vinegar. A smell that a child raised in that house would know for the rest of their life, as the smell of being unwell and being cared for at the same time. How much stood on the shelf depended entirely on the house. In the poorest cottage, there might be no more than 3 or 4 things: honey if the family kept a hive or could trade for it, salt, 1 or 2 dried herbs from the dooryard, and a pot of fat. In a more comfortable home, a yeoman's farmhouse with land and a full larder, the store might spread across several shelves and a chest besides, with waters and cordials, and bought spices among the homely stores. And in a town, in the house of a prosperous burgher, there might be a proper locked cupboard with drugs bought from the apothecary sitting beside the honey and the herbs. We will visit all 3 of those houses before the night is over. For now, it is enough to know that the shape was always the same. Rich or poor, town or country, every home kept its own small defense against the dark, and every one of them kept it close to the fire. There was no dividing line in any of these houses between the medicine shelf and the kitchen. The same honey that dressed a wound sweetened the morning bread. The same vinegar that washed a cut dressed the supper greens. The same fire that boiled the pottage warmed the poultice. A modern eye wants to separate food from physic, the pantry from the medicine chest, but the medieval household knew no such border. A thing was food until someone fell ill, and then, without any ceremony, it became medicine, and when the illness passed, it went quietly back to being food again. This is perhaps the single most important thing to understand about the whole store we are going to explore. It was not a chest of drugs. It was the ordinary furniture of daily life, waiting to be turned to a new use the moment it was needed. What is striking, when you look across the whole of medieval Europe, is how little this shelf changed from one country to the next. A traveller who could somehow have passed from a cottage in the English shires to a farmhouse in the German lands, and on to a stone house in the hills of Italy, would have found in each of them the same small handful of things kept in much the same way. Honey and vinegar, dried herbs hanging overhead, a pot of fat, a dish of salt, a few roots put by for winter. The particular plants changed a little with the climate and the local hedgerow, and the words for them changed entirely, but the shape of the store and the thinking behind it were remarkably the same wherever people kept house. It is as though every family in Europe, working quite on its own, had arrived at very nearly the same short list of what a home could not do without. Children learn the shelf almost before they learn their letters, if they ever learned their letters at all. A small child was sent to fetch the honey crock, told to carry it in both hands, and set it down gently, and in the fetching came slowly to know its weight and its place. A little older, and the same child was set to strip dried thyme from its stalk, to stir a warming cup, or to hold the cloth while a poultice was bound. None of this was taught as lessons. It was simply the ordinary work of the house, handed down by watching and doing, until a girl grown to a woman found that she carried the whole of the shelf in her head without ever being able to say when she had learned it. In this way the store was never only a store of things. It was a store of knowledge too, passed hand to hand across the generations as quietly and completely as the crocks themselves. Most of what the shelf was for happened at night. Fevers rise after dark, coughs worsen when the fire burns low, and a child who was merely fretful at supper can be truly ill by midnight. And so the shelf was, above all, a thing reached for in the dark, by the light of a single rushlight or a low-banked fire, by a mother who had risen from her own bed and would not see it again for hours. There is something quietly moving in that picture, repeated in 10,000 houses on any given winter night across the whole of Europe. A small light, a hand reaching to a familiar shelf, a remedy warmed and given, and then the long patient sitting up beside the bed until the worst of it passed and the house could sleep again. The shelf was fullest in autumn and thinnest at winter's end. All through the summer and the harvest, the household gathered and dried, and rendered and steeped, and by the time the first frosts came, the shelf and the beam above it were as crowded as they would ever be. Then, slowly, across the long cold months, the store was drawn down, a spoon of honey here, a handful of dried elder flower there, until by the hungry weeks of early spring the shelf stood nearly bare, waiting for the first green things to push up in the dooryard, and the whole patient cycle of stocking it to begin again. The old books say a careful, good wife could judge the health of her whole household by a glance at that shelf, and there is a plain truth in it. A full shelf meant a family that had gathered well and would meet the winter's illnesses ready. A bare one meant a hard season ahead. We will take the things down now, one by one, and give each of them the slow attention it was once given by the hands that kept it. Let us begin with the thing that sat at the very center of almost every such shelf in Europe, the one remedy that was food and medicine and sweetness all at once. Let us begin with the crock of honey. The crock of honey stood, in most homes that could keep one at all, at the front of the shelf where it could be reached in a hurry. It was heavy earthenware, glazed on the inside to hold the honey clean, its mouth stopped with a wooden lid or a scrap of waxed cloth tied down with twine. To open it was to release a smell that filled the whole low room at once, sweet and dark, and faintly of the flowers the bees had worked that summer. For a great many medieval families, this single crock was the most valuable thing on the entire shelf, and one of the most valuable things in the house, worth guarding, worth rationing, and worth a great deal more than its weight. In almost anything else the household owned, honey came into the house in one of two ways. A family fortunate enough to keep bees took it from their own skeps, the domed straw hives that stood in a sheltered corner of the garden, gathering it in late summer when the combs were heaviest. A family without bees bought or bartered for it from a neighbor who kept hives from the market or from the monastery. For the monasteries kept great apiaries, and honey was one of the things they sold and gave away in quantity. However it arrived, it was treated with care, decanted slowly into the household crock, and set on the shelf to be drawn on all through the year. Sugar in the medieval centuries was a rare and costly import that most people never tasted at all. Honey was the sweetness of ordinary life, and because it was also a medicine, no drop of it was ever wasted. Its first and oldest use was on wounds. Long before anyone could have said why, the household knew that honey spread over a cut, a burn, or a stubborn sore, and bound down with a clean cloth, helped it heal clean and kept the worst of the rot away. The old herbals are full of it. Honey was smeared on the raw skin of a scald, packed into a deep wound, laid over an ulcer that would not close. It was said to draw the badness out and to keep new badness from getting in, and a dressing of honey was one of the very first things a mother learned to make. Long after the medieval household was gone, those who studied such things in their laboratories would find in honey a genuine power against the small living things that spoil a wound. A reason the old dressings had worked that no one at the time could possibly have named. The good wife who reached for the honey crock when her child came in bleeding knew nothing of any of that. She knew only that it helped, because it had always helped, and that was reason enough. Its second great use was against coughs and sore throats, the endless companions of a damp medieval winter. Here honey was rarely given alone. It was the sweet base into which other things were folded, a bitter herb, a sharp root, a little vinegar, until the whole became a thick, spoonable paste that the old books call an electuary. A spoon of honey worked with crushed horehound was the standard answer to a chesty cough. Honey and vinegar, warmed together, made a syrup for a raw throat, that we will meet again when we come to the vinegar jug. Honey with a little powdered ginger or pepper stirred through it warmed a cold stomach on a bitter night. In every case the honey did two things at once. It soothed genuinely, coating a sore throat and easing a cough, and it made bearable a medicine that would otherwise have been too bitter to swallow, which mattered a great deal when the patient was a frightened, unwilling child. Then there was mead, the oldest honeyed drink of all, made by leaving honey and water to ferment together into a mild, sweet, faintly medicinal ale. In many households, the washings of the empty honey crock, the last sweetness rinsed from its sides with warm water, were saved and set aside precisely for this, so that nothing was lost. Mead flavoured with herbs, called metheglin in the old British texts, was drunk as a gentle physic, as much as a pleasure, a warm cup of it given to comfort the sick, to settle the stomach, or simply to bring a little ease and sleep at the end of a hard day. The making of it was slow and forgiving, and a crock of maturing mead in the corner was, for many families, the nearest thing they had to a medicine kept always in reserve. Honey was also, quietly, the great preserver of the whole shelf. Its own nature was to keep, almost forever without spoiling, and it passed a little of that keeping power to whatever was set within it. Petals, roots, and whole herbs were pushed down into the honey crock to hold them through the winter, so that a rose or a sprig of some summer herb could be lifted out months later still fragrant, sweetened and preserved all at once. In this way the honey crock was not only a remedy in itself, but a kind of larder within the larder, a slow, sweet keeping place for other, more fragile medicines that would otherwise not have lasted the year. Honey found its way, too, into the smaller troubles of the face and the mouth. A little of it, thinned with warm water, or with a gentle infusion of some herb, was dabbed on sore and inflamed eyes, a use the old books repeat again and again, and one that reaches back far beyond the medieval centuries into the medicine of Rome and of Egypt before it. Rubbed on the swollen gums of a teething child, or on the mouth ulcers that plagued the poorly fed through a long winter, it soothed, and it was believed, helped the rawness heal. For chapped and cracked lips, split by cold and wind, a smear of honey was the simplest comfort a house could offer, and one that cost nothing beyond a moment's reaching to the crock. There was, always, the matter of how little of it there was. A single crock had to last a family through the whole of the year, serving as sweetness as medicine, and as the base of half the other remedies on the shelf, and so it was rationed with real care. A spoonful given to a sick child was a spoonful noticed, and in the leanest households the honey was kept back almost entirely for illness, too precious to spend on mere pleasure. The old accounts that survive from larger houses list honey among the goods worth writing down and keeping count of, measured out and recorded like any other thing of value, which tells us plainly enough how the humbler households, who kept no accounts at all, must have guarded their own far smaller share. A spoon of plain honey had its own quiet uses too, needing nothing added at all. Given to someone faint or weak, it revived a little with its quick sweetness. Slipped to a fretful, wakeful child, it comforted, and it was thought helped towards sleep. Stirred into warm water, it made the simplest of drinks for a dry and tired throat. In a world with almost no other sweetness to offer the sick, the honey crock was reached for again and again, simply to bring a small, immediate comfort, a taste of something kind at a bedside where little else could be done. There is an old custom worth resting on here, at the honey crock, before we move on. In many parts of Europe, it was thought only right to tell the bees the important news of the household, a birth, a death, a marriage, murmured quietly at the hive so that the bees, who gave so much, should not be kept in ignorance of the family they served. A hive left untold, it was said, might sicken, or swarm and leave, or simply cease to thrive. whether or not anyone truly believed it. The custom says something gentle about how the honey on the shelf was regarded. It was not merely bought or taken. It was received from small and patient creatures the household genuinely admired, and the crock that held it carried a little of that gratitude with it, wherever it stood. We will leave the honey crock now, its lid pressed back down, and its sweetness sealed against the winter, and turn to the thing that stood most often at its side, its sharp and sober companion on the shelf. Where honey was sweetness and comfort, this next thing was bite and cleanliness, and no household store was ever without it. Let us turn now to the vinegar jug. The vinegar jug stood on the shelf beside the honey the way a plain, useful friend stands beside a beloved one, less prized, less guarded, and reached for very nearly as often. It was a homely thing, an earthenware jug or a small cask stopped with a wooden bung, holding a liquid that a modern kitchen keeps mostly for the salad bowl. In the medieval household, vinegar was one of the hardest working substances in the whole store, a cleanser, a preserver, a medicine, and a cook's ingredient all at once. And a house that ran short of it felt the lack in a dozen small ways at the same time. Most households made their own, or came by it almost without trying. Vinegar is only wine or oil left to sour, and in a world with neither corks nor cold cellars, wine and oil soared readily enough on their own. A cask of all gone past drinking was not thrown out. It was set aside, encouraged to turn, and became the household vinegar. In the wine, growing lands the dregs, and spoiled ends of the year's wine did the same work. There was often, in the bottom of the vinegar cask, a soft pale, jelly, like mass, that the old housewives called the mother, and a wise good wife guarded it, for a little of the mother, carried across to a fresh cask, would turn it to vinegar all the quicker. Alongside true vinegar there was verjuice, the sharp green juice pressed from crab apples or from unripe grapes, sour and rougher, kept in its own jug and used in much the same ways. The first use of the jug, as with the honey, was on wounds. Vinegar, watered a little, was the common wash for a cut, a graze, or a dirty sore, poured over to clean it before a dressing was bound on. The sharp sting of it on broken skin was familiar to every medieval child, and behind the sting lay something genuinely useful, for vinegar cleaned a wound of its fullness in a way plain water often could not. A sore that would not heal was bathed with it. A dressing was sometimes damped with it before binding. It was the plain, everyday cleaner of the household's hurts, and the smell of it, sharp and clean, was as much a part of the sick room as the smell of honey and beeswax. Then there was the oxymel we promised ourselves at the honey crock, that old and simple marriage of the shelf's two great companions. Honey and vinegar, warmed together in gentle proportion, until they thickened into a clear, sharp, sweet syrup, made one of the most trusted cough and throat remedies in all of medieval medicine. The old books praised it endlessly. A spoonful eased a raw throat, loosened a tight chest, and cut through the thick catarrh of a winter cold in a way that either honey or vinegar alone could not manage. Bitter herbs were often steeped into it, so that the oxymel carried their virtue down in a form a sick person would actually swallow. Of all the things the medicine shelf could produce in a hurry from what already stood upon it, this warm, sharp, honeyed syrup was among the most common and among the most genuinely comforting. Vinegar was also the household's answer to a fever. a cloth wrung out in vinegar and cool water, and laid across a burning forehead, renewed as often as it warmed, was the standard way of easing a high fever through a long night, cooling the skin and, it was believed, drawing the heat out of the body. The same watered vinegar was used to sponge the whole body of someone deep in fever, wrists and temples and the backs of the knees. A slow, patient tending that gave the watcher something useful to do through the dark hours, and gave the sufferer real, if simple, relief. It is one of those old practices that a modern nurse would recognize at once. A cool cloth on a hot brow, unchanged in its essentials across all the centuries between. Perhaps the most famous use of vinegar, and the one most wrapped in later story, was against bad air and contagion. In an age that believed illness travelled on foul and corrupted air, vinegar, sharp and cleansing to the nose, seemed a natural guard against it. Herbs were steeped in it: rosemary, rue, wormwood, lavender, sage, until the vinegar carried their scent, and this aromatic vinegar was sprinkled about a sick room, wiped over surfaces, and carried on a soak sponge or in a small pierced box to be held to the nose in crowded or plague-touched places. There is an old tale, told and retold in the later centuries, of 4 thieves who robbed the dead and dying during a great plague, and were spared the sickness themselves by a secret vinegar steeped with many herbs, which they gave up in exchange for their lives. Whether any such thieves ever lived hardly matters. The tale simply gathered up into a single memorable story, a practice that ordinary households had followed quietly for a very long time already, the steeping of herbs in vinegar as a guard against the unseen. The jug served the sick room in humbler ways too. Its sharp, clean smell was welcome where illness had made the air close and heavy, and a little vinegar sprinkled on the floor rushes, or wiped across a table and a window-sill, freshened a room that could not easily be opened to the cold outside. In houses where someone lay ill for a long time, this small, repeated freshening with vinegar was one of the few things that could be done to make the sick room bearable. And it was done faithfully, morning and evening, as much for the comfort of the well as of the sick. Verjuice, that sorra cousin of vinegar, kept its own quiet place among the remedies. Cooling and astringent, it was dabbed on hot swellings and inflamed skin, mixed into gargles for a sore throat, and used to bathe eyes reddened by smoke and dust. In the kitchen it sharpened sauces and dressed greens, and here again the border between food and physic simply dissolved. For a dish sharpened with verjuice was thought to sit more kindly on a delicate stomach, and to whet an appetite dulled by illness. A jug of verjuice and a jug of vinegar, standing side by side, gave the household 2 grades of soreness to reach for, the milder and the sharper, chosen for the trouble at hand. Rubbed rather than swallowed, vinegar eased the aches of the body. It was worked into the skin over a bruise or a strained muscle, sometimes warmed first, sometimes mixed with a little clay or with crushed herbs into a paste and bound over a swelling. Bee stings and the burning of nettles were dabbed with it. Aching feet, at the end of a long day walking behind the plough or the flock, were bathed in warm water sharpened with vinegar. None of this was thought remarkable. It was simply what the jug was for. One more of the countless small services it rendered a household across a year. Thinned right down with a good deal of water, vinegar even became a drink. A little of it stirred into a cup of water made a cooling thirst quenching draught for someone laboring in the summer heat or burning with fever, faintly sour, faintly refreshing, and thought to be more wholesome than plain water alone, which in many places could not be trusted. This was no medieval invention. The soldiers of Rome had carried much the same sour drink 1,000 years before, and the memory of it lingered on in the countryside long after. A cup of watered vinegar handed to a reaper at noon, or to a fevered sleeper who could keep nothing heavier down. And, quietly underneath all of this, vinegar was a great preserver. What it did for the body it did for food, holding it against decay. And the pickling of vegetables and eggs, and even meat in vinegar, was itself a kind of medicine, a way of carrying the goodness of summer's plenty deep into the hungry winter, when fresh food, and the health it gave, was hardest to come by. A well-stocked household with its crocks of pickled things had, in a real sense, laid down a store of health against the lean months. And the same jug that sawed them was the one reached for when someone finally fell ill. The old household accounts, where they survive, show vinegar bought and made in quantities that surprise a modern reader. Cask upon cask of it, far more than any kitchen alone could use. It went, we can be sure, into all the uses we have named, and 100 more besides, unremarked and unrecorded. The plainest and most patient servant on the whole medicine shelf. A house might run short of honey and manage. A house short of vinegar felt awkwardly unprepared, for a surprising share of what it knew how to do for the sick depended, one way or another, on that homely jug beside the honey. We will set the vinegar jug back in its place now, its bung pressed home, its sharp, clean smell fading into the general scent of the shelf. And we will look up, for the next of our stores did not sit on the shelf at all. It hung above it, in the shadows of the roof, gathered there across a whole summer of patient work. Let us turn now to the bundles in the rafters. Look up in almost any medieval house, and you would see the medicine as clearly as anywhere else. Hung from the beams and the rafters, from pegs and nails and lengths of twine, were bundles of dried herbs, gathered green through the warm months and hung head down in the smoky warmth of the roof to dry slowly against the coming winter. In a cottage there might be a single beam so hung. In a larger house there might be a whole loft given over to it, the drying loft, its air thick and fragrant with the mingled scent of a summer's gathering. Either way, the rafters were as much a part of the medicine store as any shelf, the place where the fresh green virtue of the garden and the hedgerow was caught and held through the dead of the year. The drying itself was a patient craft. Herbs were gathered on a dry day, ideally after the dew had lifted, but before the sun grew hot, and tied into small loose bunches, never packed too tight. For a bunch bound too thick would heat and rot at its heart instead of drying clean. The bunches were hung heads downward, up among the rafters where the air was warm and moving, but out of the direct light that would bleach the leaves and steal their strength. There they hung for days or weeks, slowly giving up their moisture, until a leaf would crumble at a touch, and the whole bunch had grown light and papery in the hand. Only then was it taken down, and the dried leaves and flowers stripped from their stalks and stored, some in linen bags, some in crocks, some left hanging to be pulled at as needed. What hung there was the whole familiar company of the household herbs: chamomile for restless nights and fretful children, mint and balm for the stomach, sage and thyme, as much for the pot as the sickbed. Wormwood, bitter and grey, hung a little apart for its strength. Elder flower and lime flower, gathered in their brief seasons, dried for the fevers and colds of the winter to come. Marjoram and hyssop, tansy and feverfew, yarrow and betony, and a dozen more besides, each in its small bunch, each known at a glance, and often at a smell in the dark. We will not follow every one of them into its every use tonight, for that is a walk through the garden, and we have taken it before. Here they concern us simply as they hung, dried and waiting, the summer's medicine stored overhead. Once a bunch was fully dry, the household had a choice in how to keep it. Some herbs were left hanging on their stalks, to be pulled at a sprig at a time through the winter, which suited the tougher, woodier kinds. The more delicate leaves and flowers were stripped from their stems and rubbed gently through the fingers or a coarse sieve, then folded into small linen bags or tipped into stoppered crocks, where they kept their scent far longer than they would have hanging in the open, smoky air. A tidy good wife knew each bag and crock by its place and its feel, and could send a child to the right one in the dark, for here too there were no written labels, only the long memory of the hands that had filled them. If any single thing was dried in real quantity, hung in bunch after bunch, until it seemed half the roof was given over to it, it was often the elder. Its flat creamy heads of flower, gathered in early summer, dried for the fevers and colds of the year to come, and its dark berries, gathered in autumn and cooked down into a dark syrup, made the household's great standby against the coughs and chills of winter. A house well hung with dried elder flower, and a crock of elderberry syrup put by, felt itself ready for whatever the cold months might bring, and the sight of those pale flower heads drying overhead was, to many a family, the plainest sign that summer had truly come. In a modest cottage, all of this hung in the one main room, where the smoke of the central fire, drifting up through the roof, helped the drying along and, it was thought, helped keep the moth and the weevil from the stored bunches. In a grander house the drying was done apart, in a loft or an upper chamber or a dedicated still room, away from the cooking smells and the traffic of the kitchen. But the principle was the same in the palace and the hovel. Catch the green things at their strongest. Hang them where the air would dry them slow and clean, and so carry the medicine of July into the sick room of January. Not everything that hung from the beams was meant to be swallowed or steeped. A great deal of it was there simply to sweeten and cleanse the air of the house itself. Bunches of sweet, smelling herbs, lavender and meadowsweet, southernwood and dried rose, were hung to freshen a room. And the same herbs, along with fresh rushes, were strewn across the beaten earth or plank floor to be crushed underfoot and give up their scent as the household moved about. This strewing was no mere nicety. In a world of close air, damp floors, and ever-present vermin, the strewing herbs were a genuine part of keeping a house healthy, discouraging fleas and moths, masking the smells of a crowded life, and, it was believed, guarding against the bad air that carried illness. When someone did fall ill, the herbs overhead served the sick room in another way still, through fire and smoke. A few sprigs of a cleansing herb, rosemary or juniper or wormwood, cast onto the embers filled the room with a sharp, fragrant smoke that was thought to drive out corruption and purify the close air around a sickbed. This fumigating of a room, simple and quick and drawing on nothing but what already hung from the beam, was one of the commonest of all responses to serious illness in the house, done as much for the reassurance of the smell as for any deeper reason, and comforting for exactly that. Not every bundle hung within easy reach. The stronger herbs, the ones that healed in a small dose and harmed in a large one, were kept deliberately high and apart, up where a curious child could not pull them down. Every household that gathered its own medicine knew that the line between remedy and poison was often only a matter of quantity, and so the fiercer plants hung by themselves in a far corner of the beam or the loft, known to the woman of the house and to few others, taken down carefully and measured with real attention. This quiet separating of the gentle from the dangerous, done without any written rule, was one of the plainest expressions of how seriously the household took the store above its head. The bundles did not keep forever, and a careful household knew it. Dried herbs hold their virtue for a season, perhaps a little more, and then slowly fade, their scent thinning, their color dulling to a lifeless gray-brown, until what hangs from the beam is no longer medicine, but only dust. The good wife judged this by eye and by nose, crushing a leaf between her fingers and breathing it in. If the scent rose sharp and true, the herb was good. If it came faint and flat, the bunch was taken down and thrown to the fire, and its place kept empty against the new gathering. Nothing was more useless, and quietly more dangerous, than a store of herbs believed good that had in truth lost all their strength, and so this small, regular testing was part of keeping the Rafters honest. There is a plain, pleasing image to rest on here, before we come down from the roof. The bundles in the Rafters were, more than almost anything else in the house, the calendar of the year made visible. To look up at them in deep winter was to see the whole of the past summer hanging there, the June meadow and the July hedgerow and the August garden gathered and dried and held safe overhead. A child lying ill in a low bed, looking up through the firelight at those slowly turning bunches, was looking up at the warm months themselves, kept close against the cold, waiting to be taken down a pinch at a time and turned back into warmth and ease. It is a gentle thing to picture, and a gentle place to leave the Rafters, their bundles stirring faintly in the rising heat of the fire. We will come down now from the beams and turn to a smaller, more guarded corner of the store, to two things kept close and counted careful, one common as earth and one dear as silver, and both of them medicine in their way. Let us turn now to the salt box and the spice pouch. Two things stood on the shelf that were counted more carefully than anything else upon it, and for opposite reasons. One was common as the earth underfoot, and yet too useful to waste a grain of. The other was dear as silver and locked away when a house was fine enough to have a lock. The salt box and the spice pouch sat near one another, the plain and the precious, and both of them were medicine as surely as they were seasoning. The salt box was kept close to the fire, and for a good reason. Salt draws damp from the air and clots and spoils if it is left in a cold, wet corner. And so it lived in a small wooden box, or a stoppered crock in the driest, warmest place the household could give it, often on a little shelf built into the chimney breast itself. To let the salt grow damp was a small disgrace to a careful good wife, and children were taught early to keep the lid pressed down. Salt was too valuable and too needful to be treated carelessly. Its first and greatest work was preserving. Without salt, the meat of the autumn slaughter could not be carried into the winter, and a family without salted meat and salted fish faced the lean months with far less to eat and far less strength to meet illness with. In this plain sense, salt was the foundation of the whole household's health, standing behind every barrel of salt pork and every dried salt fish that saw a family through to spring. The old people understood this without needing it explained. A house with salt could keep itself fed through the dark of the year, and a well-fed house was a house that met the winter fevers with something in reserve. Salt was medicine, too, in its own right. A pinch of it dissolved in warm water made the oldest gargle in the world, reached for at the first scratch of a sore throat, and trusted across every rank of society from the cottage to the castle. The same salt water was used to bathe a wound, to rinse a sore mouth, to wash inflamed and weeping eyes. Rubbed gently on aching, bleeding gums, salt was thought to firm them and ease the pain. A little of it, taken in water, was a common answer to a sore or overloaded stomach, and warmed. A bag of dry salt heated by the fire and wrapped in cloth held its heat a long while, and was pressed against an aching ear, a stiff neck, or a cramping belly, one of the gentlest and most comforting of all the household's remedies for pain. We reckon the value of salt poorly now, for it costs us almost nothing. In the medieval world, it was a thing of real worth, taxed and traded and fought over, carried long distances by pack and by ship, and a man of steady, reliable work was said to be worth his salt precisely, because salt was the measure of something genuinely valuable. The salt box, plain as it looked, held a small treasure, and its honored place near the fire. Dry and guarded, and never quite allowed to run empty, said as much about how the household saw it as any words could. Let us turn now from the common treasure to the rare one, from the salt box to the spice pouch beside it. If salt was dear, spice was dearer by far, and the little pouch or the small carved box that held the household's spices was, in many homes, the most valuable thing under the roof. Pepper and ginger, cinnamon and cloves, nutmeg and mace, and rarest of all saffron, came from the far ends of the known world, carried across seas and deserts, and through the hands of a dozen merchants, before ever reaching a market where a family might buy a few grains at a time. To own spice at all was a small mark of comfort. To own it in any quantity was a mark of real wealth, and in the houses that had it, the spice was kept under lock, measured with a careful hand, and used as much for medicine as for the pleasure of the table. Pepper was the everyday luxury. The spice a family of modest means might just manage to keep a little of. Sharp and warming, it was thought to kindle a cold and sluggish stomach, to stir a poor appetite, and to help the body throw off the chills and heaviness of damp weather. A few grains crushed into a warm drink, or stirred through the honey of an electuary, carried real heat down into a cold body, and this warming, in the medicine of the time, was itself a kind of cure. Ginger did much the same work, and was, if anything, more prized still for it. Kept as a dried, knotted root or ground to a pale powder, ginger was the great warmer of the medicine shelf, given for a cold stomach, for the griping pains that followed a poor meal, for sickness of the stomach, and for the first chill of a coming cold. A cup of warm ale or wine, with ginger stirred through. It was among the most comforting things a household could offer someone shivering at the edge of illness, and one of the most genuinely effective. For ginger truly does settle a troubled stomach, as many a modern kitchen still quietly remembers. Cinnamon and cloves lay in the pouch beside them, each with its own place. Cinnamon, sweet and warming, went into cordials and comforting drinks, and was thought to strengthen a weak body and lift a low spirit. Cloves, small and dark and fiercely pungent, held one particular fame above all others: a single clove, pressed against an aching tooth and held there, numbed the pain in a way that seemed almost miraculous to those who used it. And the clove kept this reputation as the household's toothache remedy for centuries, long enough that its power against dental pain would one day be confirmed in ways the medieval sufferer could never have imagined. To a family plagued, as most were, by the slow ruin of their teeth, a few cloves in the spice box were worth their small weight many times over. Nutmeg and mace, the two spices that come from a single fruit, were kept for warming cordials and for settling the stomach, and nutmeg especially gathered to itself a reputation for calming and for bringing on sleep, so that a little grated into a warm posset at bedtime was thought to ease a restless night. And then there was saffron, the dearest spice of all, gathered thread by thread from the hearts of countless small flowers, so costly that it was weighed out almost grain by grain. Saffron was reached for in real trouble, believed to gladden the heart and lift the spirits of someone sunk in illness or melancholy, and folded into the most precious cordials a house could make. In many households, a few threads of saffron were the single most valuable medicine on the whole shelf, kept back for the gravest need. Behind all of this lay a way of thinking about the body that gave spice its place in medicine as much as in cookery. The learned physic of the age held that the body was governed by balances of heat and cold, of dry and moist, and that illness came when these fell out of true. The warming spices, pepper and ginger and cinnamon, were understood to carry heat into a body gone cold and damp, righting the balance. And so a warming, spiced drink was not merely pleasant, but was thought to be doing real medical work. The ordinary household knew little of the theory and cared less, but it had absorbed the practice completely. When someone took a chill, you warmed them from the inside with spice, and it helped, and that was enough. Spice, more than anything else on the shelf, marked the difference between one household and another. In the poorest cottage, there might be no spice at all, or a single treasured pinch of pepper, kept for the worst illness of the year. In a comfortable farmhouse, there might be a small box with a little of several kinds. And in a wealthy town house, there might be a locked cabinet of them, weighed and recorded, and refilled from the grocer and the apothecary. For it was the spice merchants, the grocers and the apothecaries, who dealt in these same costly powders, both as food and as physic, and the line between the kitchen's spice and the apothecary's drug was, in the case of spice, no line at all. We will find that locked cabinet again when we come to the Burgher's townhouse later tonight. For now, it is enough to see the little pouch on the ordinary shelf, holding its few precious grains, and to understand that in reaching for it, the household was reaching for both its finest flavor and its strongest medicine at once. We will draw the string tight on the spice pouch now, and set it back beside the salt, the precious and the plain restored to their places. And we will turn to something softer and homelier, a thing that sat near the fire and went soft in the warmth, the greasy, unglamorous foundation of half the cures the household could make. Let us turn now to the pot of fat and the Salve Crocks beside it. Somewhere near the fire, where the warmth kept it soft and workable, stood a pot of fat. It was not a lovely thing to look at. A crock of pale, greasy, faintly yellow-rendered fat, skimmed and saved and set by. And yet it was one of the most quietly useful things in the whole store, for fat was the body of nearly every salve and ointment the household knew how to make. Where honey and vinegar and herbs supplied the virtue of a remedy, fat supplied the substance that carried it, that held it on the skin, that softened and soothed and sealed. A house without a pot of fat could hardly make an ointment at all. The fat itself came from the animals of the household and the farm. Mutton and beef fat, rendered down and clarified, made tallow, firm and long, keeping the commonest base of all. Pig fat made lard, softer and easier to work. Goose grease, saved carefully whenever a goose was killed, was prized above all the others, thought to be the most penetrating and soothing of the fats, and kept apart for the best users. Butter served too, and the marrow from cracked bones, and any clean fat the kitchen could spare. Whatever their source, these fats were skimmed and saved through the year, for nothing greasy was ever thrown away in a careful house, and all of it went, in the end, either into the cooking or onto the skin. Goose grease deserves its own moment, so beloved was it. Rubbed thickly onto the chest and the back of someone with a deep, rattling cough, and covered with a warmed cloth. It was one of the oldest and most trusted answers to a winter chest, its warmth and its gentle covering easing the labor of breathing through a bad night. Smeared on chapped and cracked hands, on wind, burned faces, on the raw split skin of heels and knuckles worn by cold and work, it softened and healed where nothing gentler would serve. A crock of goose grease put by in autumn was a small insurance against the whole of the coming winter's coughs and chapping, and it was guarded almost as carefully as the honey. To make a salve was a simple, patient business. Herbs were gathered and bruised and set to simmer very gently in the fat, over the lowest possible heat, for a long while, until the fat had drawn out the color and the virtue of the plant and taken on its scent. Then the whole was strained through a cloth, the spent herbs pressed and discarded, and the green or golden fat left to cool and set into a soft ointment. A little beeswax, melted in, would stiffen a salve that was wanted firmer, for a salve to carry about or to spread thick. Poured warm into small crocks and left to harden, and sealed against the air, these ointments kept for months, and a row of small salve crocks was a common and comforting sight at one end of the medicine shelf. Beeswax earned its own small place in this work, and its own quiet corner of the store. Saved whenever the combs were pressed for their honey, cleaned and set into pale cakes, it went into the firmer salves and the plasters, and on its own, melted with a little oil, it made a simple balm for cracked lips and chapped skin. The same wax sealed the mouths of crocks against the air, stiffened a thread into a taper, and burned, in the better households, as a clean, sweet candle far finer than the smoking tallow dip of the poor. Wax and honey came from the same patient bees, and both of them, in their different ways, found their place on the medicine shelf. The most familiar of all was the green ointment, the plain all-purpose herb salve that nearly every household made in some form. Made most often with the healing herbs of the dooryard, marigold above all, and with plantain, woundwort, comfrey, or whatever the house trusted most. It was the ointment reached for by default, for cuts and grazes, for sores that would not close, for chapped and inflamed skin of every kind. The marigold salve especially, made from the bright petals worked into fat, was famous across all of Europe for wounds and for the sore, cracked skin of hard working hands, and a crock of it stood in cottage and manor alike. Comfrey ointment, made from the root of that great healer of broken places, was kept for bruises and sprains and deep soreness. Between 2 or 3 such salves, a household could meet almost any hurt to the skin that daily life could inflict. The reach of these salves ran through the whole ordinary catalogue of small bodily troubles. They were smeared on burns and scalds once the first heat had passed, on the raw skin of piles, on rashes and chafing, and the sore places left by rough cloth against tender skin. A nursing mother with cracked and painful nipples reached for a gentle salve, and so, in her turn, did the good wife for a cow with a sore and chapped udder, for the same crock that served the family often served its animals as well. Nothing about the household's medicine drew a hard line between people and beasts. A useful ointment was a useful ointment, and it went wherever skin was broken or sore. How a salve was carried to the hurt mattered nearly as much as the salve itself. For a small sore, it was simply smeared on with a fingertip. For a larger trouble, it was spread thick on a scrap of clean linen or soft leather, warmed a little, and bound over the place so that it stayed against the skin and did its slow work through the night. Spread and bound in this way, a salve became what the old books called a plaster, and the making and binding of plasters over a bruise, a boil, an aching joint, or a congested chest was among the commonest of all the evening tasks in a house where someone lay unwell. The crocks themselves told a small story of the household's care. In a poor house there might be a single crock of green ointment doing the work of all the rest. In a better house there might be a row of them, each for its own purpose: the marigold for wounds, the comfrey for bruises, a soothing one for burns, a milder one kept for the tender skin of babies. And a good wife knew each by sight and smell, for here, as everywhere on the shelf, there were no labels, only knowledge. She knew which crock was which, and which was oldest, and which had begun faintly to turn. For turning was the great enemy of the salve crock. Fat goes rancid in time, especially in the warmth beside the fire, where the salves were kept soft, and a rancid salve was worse than useless. Sour, smelling and spoiled, no longer a comfort but an offence. And so salves were made in small batches, enough to serve a season and no more, and a careful household made them fresh each year, rendering new fat after the autumn slaughter, and steeping the last of the summer's herbs into it before the cold set in. The good wife judged an old salve by its smell, as she judged everything, and a crock gone rancid went to the fire without ceremony, its place kept for the new making. There was, in all of this, a natural rhythm tied to the turning year. The great time of rendering fat was the autumn, at the season of slaughter, when the animals that could not be kept through winter were killed and salted down. This was when the household's fat was replenished for the year, when the tallow was run and the lard tried out and the goose grease saved, and when, in the same busy weeks, the last of the herbs still hanging in the rafters were steeped into the new fat to make the salves that would serve. until the next autumn came round again. The making of the medicine shelf and the laying in of the winter's food were, in this as in so much else, the very same work, done at the same fireside in the same short season of plenty before the cold. There is a homely dignity in that greasy pot by the fire, for all its lack of beauty. It asked nothing of the far ends of the earth as the spices did. It cost no silver. It was only what the household's own animals had given, saved and clarified, and kept soft in the warmth, waiting to be turned into comfort for chapped hands and aching chests and the small hurts of a hard, working life. Of everything on the shelf, the pot of fat was perhaps the most purely homemade, the most entirely the household's own, and it served that household faithfully, crock after crock, winter after winter. We will leave the Salve Crocks now, their lids pressed down over their soft green and golden contents, and turn to something finer and more fragrant, kept not in earthenware crocks, but in small precious flasks, drawn off drop by drop and treasured. Let us turn now to the little flasks of water and oil. At the finer end of the shelf, kept a little apart from the homely crocks and jugs, stood a handful of small flasks. Some were glass, precious and rare, bought or come by with difficulty and guarded accordingly. Others were small glazed bottles of earthenware, stopped tight with a twist of waxed cloth or a carved wooden plug. Whatever they were made of, they held the most refined medicines the household could make or buy. The distilled waters and the infused oils, drawn off and kept drop by careful drop, and reached for not by the spoonful, but by the few precious drops at a time. The waters came first in the esteem of most households, and they were, in the fuller sense of the word, distilled, to make a true water. Herbs or flowers were steeped, and then gently heated in a vessel called a limbeck, an alembic, its curved head catching the rising steam and running it down a cool arm to drip, clear and fragrant, into a waiting flask. This was skilled and patient work, and the still itself was a prized possession, so that in many households the making of waters belonged to the wealthier still room rather than the cottage fire. But the waters themselves, once made, traded and travelled, and a small flask of a good water might find its way even into a modest home as a gift, a purchase, or an inheritance. Rose water was the queen of them all. Cooling, sweet, and gentle, it was dabbed on hot and tired eyes, patted onto skin inflamed by fever or by the sun, and stirred into cordials and comforting drinks to lift and please a failing appetite. It freshened the close air of a sick room, sprinkled from the flask, and it carried, in its scent alone, a kind of comfort that the plainer remedies could not. A flask of rose water was among the most treasured things the finer shelf could hold, and it was used sparingly, a few drops at a time, to make its precious store last. Elder, flower water stood close behind it, milder and easier to come by, for the elder gave its creamy heads of flower freely to any household near a hedge. Distilled or simply steeped, elder, flower water was the household's gentle wash for the eyes and the skin, cooling to inflammation, soothing to a face reddened by weather or by weeping, and mild enough to use on the tender skin of a child. Where rose water was a small luxury, elder, flower water was very nearly within every household's reach, and it did much of the same quiet, cooling work. The wealthier still room made many more besides, a whole company of waters. Lavender water for the head and the spirits, mint water for the stomach, and the compound waters, the plague waters and cordial waters made from many herbs distilled together, each household guarding its own receipt for them, handed down and traded between friends. These finer waters belonged more to the manor and the town house than to the cottage. And we will meet the still room that made them properly a little later in our evening. Here it is enough to know that a small flask or two of some good water might stand even on a humble shelf, precious and fragrant, reached for in the gentlest of troubles. The poorest households, without a still and without the coin to buy the finished waters, made their own humbler versions all the same. A handful of fresh flowers or leaves left to steep in water by the warmth of the fire, or set in the sun on a bright day, or simply left to stand overnight in cold water, gave up something of their scent and their virtue into a rough, homemade water that would not keep long but served for a day or two well enough. It was not the clear distilled water of the still room, but it did much of the same cooling, soothing work, and it cost nothing but the gathering. In this, as in so much else, the poor arrived at the same comfort by a simpler road. Strongest of all the waters was the one the old books called aqua vita, the water of life, the clear burning spirit drawn off by distilling wine or ale a second, and a third time, fierce and fiery, where the flower waters were cool and mild. It was reached for in the gravest need, a few drops given to revive someone who had fainted or fallen into a deathly chill, or rubbed on the temples and the chest to call the warmth and the spirit back into a failing body. It was also the finest base for a cordial, drawing out and holding the virtue of precious herbs and spices far more strongly than ale or wine could. Costly and difficult to make, kept in the smallest flask of all and guarded closely, aqua vita was the household's strong medicine of last resort, and a very little of it went a very long way. There was, to those who first watched it, something close to marvelous in the working of the still. To see a rough mash of herbs and water heated over a low fire, and then to watch a clear, pure, fragrant liquid gather drop by drop at the end of the cool arm and fall into the waiting flask, seemed a kind of quiet wonder, the very spirit of the plant coaxed out and caught. The old writers spoke of distillation in just such terms as a drawing forth of a thing's hidden virtue, its purest self set free from the coarse body that had held it. For the household lucky enough to own a still, the slow gathering of the drops was one of the small satisfactions of the still room, watched over with patience through a long afternoon while the flask filled and the whole room grew fragrant. Let us turn now from the waters to the oils, kept in their own small flasks close beside, where a water carried the cooling, watery virtue of a plant. An oil carried its warming, penetrating one, and the household's infused oils were among the most valued of all its salving and rubbing remedies. An oil was made by steeping a herb in oil, warming it very gently or leaving it in the sun for days or weeks, until the oil had drawn out the plant's color and virtue, and then straining it clear into a flask. Such oils kept well, better than most watery things, and a good one, made in summer, served through the whole of the year. The most famous of them all was the red oil of St. John's wort, made by steeping the small yellow flowers of that plant in oil and leaving it in the summer sun. The oil slowly turned a deep and startling blood red, and this red oil was treasured for wounds, for burns, for bruises, and for the aches of nerve and muscle, rubbed into the skin over a hurt or a soreness. There was something almost wondrous in the way the pale gold oil deepened to red as it stood in the light, and the household that made it watched the change each summer with quiet satisfaction, knowing that a fine store of the best wound oil was making itself on the windowsill. Other oils were made in the same patient way. Rose oil, cooling and sweet, for hot and inflamed skin. Chamomile oil, gentle and calming, for aching bellies, and for the massage of a fretful child. Elder oil and others besides, each household making the ones it trusted most from the herbs closest to hand. And each of these oils served in more than one way. Rubbed on directly for aches and chapping, dropped warm into an aching ear to ease the pain, worked into stiff and painful joints, or used as the finer base of a specially made ointment or balm. Oil for rubbing was, in truth, one of the great comforts the household could offer. A warm oil worked slowly into an aching back, a stiff neck, a cramping limb, or the sore, tired body of someone long confined to bed, brought a relief that no swallowed remedy could match, and the slow, patient rubbing itself, the touch of a caring hand, was half the medicine. For earache especially, that sharp and miserable pain so common in draughty houses, a few drops of warmed oil dripped gently into the ear was among the kindest things a household knew how to do, and one of the oldest. The oil itself, though, was not always easy to come by in the northern lands. Olive oil, the finest base, came from the warm south and was costly to carry north, so that in England and the German lands it was a dearer thing than in Italy or Spain. Northern households made do with what they had, oils pressed from nuts or from linseed, or leaned more heavily on their rendered fats, which did much the same work in a homelier way. In the sunny south, where the olive grew, oil was cheap and everywhere, and the infused oils were richer and more plentiful for it. This, too, was one of the small ways the medicine shelf changed as you traveled across Europe, growing oilier in the south and greasier in the north, each region leaning on what its own land gave freely. Waters and oils alike had to be kept with care, stopped tight against the air, kept cool and out of the light. They held their virtue for a season or a year, but they spoiled in the end, as all things did, the waters growing flat and cloudy, the oils turning rancid and sharp. And so these too were made in modest amounts, tested by nose and eye, and renewed as the seasons allowed. The small flasks that held them were themselves valuable, cleaned and saved and used again year after year, for good glass and good glazed ware were not things a household came by lightly. Of everything on the shelf, these little flasks held the most precious drops. A crock of honey might be measured in spoonfuls, a jug of vinegar in cupfuls. But a flask of rose water or of red oil was measured in drops, brought out for the finer troubles and the gentler needs, for tired eyes and inflamed skin, and the aches that would yield to a warm and fragrant rubbing. They were the small luxuries of the medicine shelf, the nearest thing an ordinary house had to something delicate and refined, and they were treasured accordingly. We will stop the little flasks tight now and set them back in their cool, dark corner, their few precious drops safe against the year, and we will turn to something warmer and more everyday, to the drink that was food and medicine and daily comfort all at once, and to the special cups kept for carrying it to the sick. Let us turn now to the owl, pot, and the Caudle Cup. In the medieval house, all was not a pleasure kept for feasts. It was the ordinary drink of every day, brewed at home in most households, poured for young and old alike, and drunk in place of water, because water, in so many places, simply could not be trusted. Where a well or a stream ran foul, ale weak and freshly brewed was the safer thirst quencher, and the ale pot was as constant a presence in the house as the cooking pot itself. This plain fact made all, quietly, one of the foundations of the household's health and one of its most important medicines, though few would have thought to call it so. The brewing of the household's ale was itself a regular labor, done every few weeks, for all did not keep long and had to be made fresh again and again. In many homes it was the women's work, the alewife of the house steeping the malted grain, drawing off the sweet wort, and setting it to work in the great tub. And a good brewer was valued in a village nearly as much as a good baker, because the ale was brewed at home and drunk so young. It was mild and wholesome, and the steady round of brewing meant there was almost always a fresh, gentle drink in the house for whoever fell ill and had need of it. The medicine of the ale pot began in this way, weeks before any illness at the brewing tub. The weakest ale, the small beer brewed thin and low, was the drink of children and of the sick, gentle enough to give a fevered patient or a fretful child, faintly nourishing and above all safe. Small beer was poured freely to those who could stomach little else. A sick person who would eat nothing could often be persuaded to sip a little warm small beer, and in it took in something of goodness and strength when all solid food was refused. For this reason alone the household's brewing was a kind of medicine making, and the good wife who kept good ale in the house kept, in the same act, a store of gentle nourishment for whoever next fell ill. Ale was also the great base into which other medicines were folded. Warmed and stirred through with herbs, with spices, with honey, it carried a remedy down in a form the sick would willingly drink. A cup of warm ale with sage steeped in it, or with a little ginger, or with honey and a bitter herb, was among the commonest of all the household's medicine drinks, easy to make from what stood on the shelf and comforting to take. Where a plain bitter draught might be refused, the same medicine in a cup of warm, sweetened all went down without complaint. From this it was a short step to the caudle, one of the most cherished of all the sick-room drinks. A caudle was warm ale or wine, thickened with egg yolks or with fine oatmeal, sweetened with honey, and spiced with whatever the house could spare, ginger, cinnamon, a little precious saffron in the finer homes. Thick, warm, and nourishing, halfway between a drink and a food, it was given to the sick, to the weak, and above all to women recovering from childbirth, for whom a good caudle was thought both a comfort and a restoring of strength. To make someone a caudle was to make them a small, warm act of care, and the caudle cup itself, kept for the purpose, carried that meaning with it. The posset was its close and gentle cousin, made by curdling hot milk with ale or wine, then sweetening and spicing it. The posset separated into a thin, comforting way beneath a soft curd, and it was drunk warm for colds, for chills, and taken at bedtime to ease the drinker into sleep. A posset with a little nutmeg grated over it, or made with a warming herb, was the household's classic bedtime comfort for someone starting a cold, warming from within, settling the stomach, and coaxing a restless body toward rest. Special vessels were kept for it in better houses, the posset pot with its little spout for sipping the whey from beneath the curd, but in a cottage any warm cup served. Ale itself was sometimes brewed with medicine already in it. Wormwood ale, bitter and cleansing, was drunk for the stomach and to sharpen a dull appetite. Sage ale and ale steeped with other herbs, each carried its own gentle virtue, so that the very brewing of the household's drink became one more way of laying in medicine. A crock of some herb, all standing, in the cool was, in effect, a remedy kept always ready, to be poured warm whenever the need arose. It would be wrong to picture all this drinking as indulgence. The ale of every day was weak, brewed to quench thirst, and to nourish rather than to cloud the head, and a working household drank it much as we might drink water or milk, steadily and without a second thought. It counted as food as much as drink, a real part of the daily bread of the poor, giving warmth and a little strength across a long day of labor. Drunkenness was known and frowned upon, but the ordinary ale pot was a sober thing, a wholesome staple of the table, and the medicine drinks made from it borrowed that same plain, nourishing character. There was nothing heady in a warm caudle or a bedtime posset, only comfort and quiet, and the slow return of ease. On the coldest nights the household made a warming cup of a different kind, hot ale beaten up with a little butter, a spoon of honey, and a dusting of spice, drunk down before bed to drive the chill from the bones. Buttered ale of this sort was a labourer's comfort at the end of a bitter day, warming, filling, and faintly medicinal, and it sent a cold and weary body to its bed thawed and eased. It cured nothing in itself, but on a hard winter night it was cure enough, and it was made in cottage and hall alike, whenever the frost bit deep. Wine, dearer and rarer in the northern lands, kept its own place for the graver troubles. Where all was the everyday base, wine was reached for in serious illness, warmed and spiced into a cordial for someone dangerously weak, or used as the base of the finest restoring drinks a house could make. In the wine, growing south, it was commoner and cheaper, and did more of the ordinary work that all did in the north, but everywhere it carried a sense of being the stronger, finer medicine, kept for when it was truly needed. The warm drink, in all these forms, was really the whole ritual of care distilled into a single cup. To warm the ale, to stir in the honey and the spice, to thicken the caudle and carry it to the bedside, to lift a weak head and hold the cup to dry lips, was to do, in one unbroken act, the whole of what a household could do for someone it loved and could not otherwise cure. The drink comforted, warmed, and nourished, and the giving of it comforted the giver too, and in a great many illnesses that was the truest and best medicine the shelf had to offer. For the sick, the household kept its own particular vessels, and these were part of the medicine store as surely as any crock. A special cup for the invalid, easy to hold to weak lips, a spouted pot for a patient who could not sit up to sip, a small horn or wooden bowl kept clean for the sick room and used for nothing else. All of these lived with the Caudle Cup and came out whenever illness came into the house. The old inventories of larger households list such things among their goods: the posset pots and the Caudle Cups and the little covered bowls, kept apart and valued, plain proof of how carefully even the vessels of care were guarded. In humbler homes there were no such fine wares, but even there a particular cup was often set aside for the sick, washed with special care, and returned to its place when the illness had passed. There is a quiet fittingness in ending this part of our shelf with the bedtime posset, warm and spiced and sweet, carried up to someone shivering at the start of a cold and drunk slowly in the last of the firelight before sleep. It asked nothing difficult. It cured little on its own, but it warmed and it comforted. And it eased a troubled body toward the rest that would do the real healing, and for that it was loved and made and given, night after night, in house after house, across the whole of the medieval world. We will rinse the Caudle Cup now, and set it back among the vessels kept for the sick, and turn to the harder, woodier stores that carried the household through the depth of winter, the roots and barks kept dry in a bag or a box against the cold. Let us turn now to the bag of roots and barks. Not all of the household's medicine hung in the light and the warmth. Some of it lay in the dark, in a stout linen bag or a plain wooden box pushed to the back of the shelf, holding the dried roots and barks that carried a family through the deepest part of the winter. These were the hard stores, the woody, long keeping ones, dug and stripped in autumn when the leaves were gone, and drawn on through the cold months when nothing green remained to gather. Where the herb bundles overhead were the medicine of summer caught and dried. The bag of roots and barks was the medicine of the deep earth and the standing tree, and it kept longest of all. There was good sense in leaning on roots and barks through the winter, and the household understood it in its bones if not in words. A root is the plant's own store, dense and dry and full of virtue, and once dug and dried well it holds that virtue a long while, a year or two or more, far longer than any leaf or flower. Bark stripped from a branch is the same, tough and lasting. So when the garden was bare, and the rafters held only fading bundles, the family still had, in that dark bag at the back of the shelf, a store of strong medicine that the cold could not touch, waiting to be boiled up into the deep, warming remedies that a hard winter always seemed to need. Roots asked for a particular kind of preparing, both in the storing and in the using. Dug in the autumn, they were washed clean of the earth, sliced across so they would dry through and not rot, and set to dry slowly in a warm, airy place until they were hard and light, and where a leaf or a flower gave up its virtue readily to a cup of hot water, a hard root or a piece of bark would not. It had to be boiled, and boiled long, simmered in water over the fire until the water drew out its strength, and this long, slow boiling made what the old books called a decoction, the signature preparation of the whole root and bark store. A pot of some root set to simmer at the back of the fire, filling the house with its earthy smell, was a common sight through the winter months. Chief among the roots, in many a household, was elecampane, that tall yellow flowered plant whose great root was one of the most trusted of all winter medicines, called elfwort and horseheel in the old country names. Its root was dug, dried, and kept for the chest, boiled into a decoction for deep, stubborn coughs, or candied slowly in honey into a sweet that could be sucked to ease a raw throat and a laboring chest. For the long, rattling coughs of a damp winter, elecampane was among the first things the household reached into the root bag for, and its reputation for the lungs lasted many centuries. Beside it, where a household could get it, lay licorice, the sweet root that needed no honey to make it pleasant. Chewed on its own, or boiled into a sweet, dark decoction, licorice soothed a cough and eased a sore throat, and its natural sweetness made it a favorite for children and a welcome softener of harsher medicines. even where it had to be bought rather than grown. A little licorice root in the bag was prized, both for its own soothing virtue and for the way it made a bitter draught bearable. Angelica gave its root and its stem to the store, warming and aromatic, valued for a cold and troubled stomach, for the chest, and, in the years of plague and fever, as one of the herbs believed to guard the body against contagion. Its thick stems were candied into a sweet green comfit, and its root was boiled into warming cordials and drinks for a body chilled through. There was a brightness and a warmth to Angelica that made it welcome in the dark of the year, and it kept its place among the household's trusted winter roots across the whole of Europe. The root of the marsh mallow held a different and gentler virtue, all softness and soothing. Boiled in water, it gave up a thick, slippery substance that coated and calmed whatever it touched, and this made it a favorite for a raw and rasping throat, for a harsh cough, and mashed warm into a poultice for angry swellings and inflamed skin, where the sharper remedies bit and stung. The mallow root soothed, and for the tenderest and most painful troubles, it was often the kindest thing the root bag could offer. Valerian root earned its place for the nerves and the night. Dug and dried like the rest, and kept of necessity a little apart for its strong and earthy smell, it was boiled into a decoction given for restlessness, for a troubled and anxious mind, and to ease a sleepless body toward rest. Its reputation as a settler of the nerves and a bringer of sleep was old and widespread, and a household that grew or gathered valerian kept a store of its root against the wakeful, worried nights that come to every family in their turn. Comfrey, which we met already as an ointment for bruises, gave its root to the winter bag as well, and here it earned its old country name of knitbone. Grated and worked into a thick paste with warm water, packed around a broken or badly wrenched limb and bound, comfrey root paste dried hard and held the injury still while it mended, doing much of the work a modern splint would do. Boiled into a decoction, it was also given inwardly for troubles of the chest and the gut. Few roots were more trusted for serious hurts, and a good store of dried comfrey root was a real comfort to a household that lived, as all of them did, close to the daily risk of a bad fall. Among the barks, willow held the first place, and it holds a special interest for us now. The bark of the willow, stripped from a young branch, chewed on its own or boiled into a bitter decoction, was the old country answer to fevers, to headaches, and to the aches of the joints and the body. It worked genuinely, and the household that reached for it knew only that it did. Long centuries later, those who studied such things would find in willow bark the very substance from which one of the world's most familiar medicines against pain and fever would be made. A plain confirmation, arrived at far too late to matter to any medieval sufferer, of what the old bark chewers had known all along. Oak bark held the opposite virtue, all binding and drying where the willow eased and cooled. Rough and astringent, it was boiled into a decoction and given for the fluxes and loosenesses of the bowel that could carry off the weak in a bad season, and used as a gargle for a relaxed and sore throat, and as a wash for weeping sores and inflamed skin. The same drying, tightening power that made oak bark useful in the tanning of leather made it useful, in a gentler measure, on and in the human body, and a piece of it in the bark bag was a plain, reliable standby for a troubled gut. Other barks lay among them, each with its use. Wild cherry bark for coughs, its virtue for the chest well known. The barks of alder and of elm for their own troubles, gathered where the trees grew close. And, in the households that could afford them, the bought roots and barks of the spice trade lay alongside the homegrown ones. Dried ginger and galangal and the like, roots and rhizomes from far away, that served as both spice and medicine and blurred, once again, the line between the two. To draw the virtue out of all these hard stores, the household leaned, night after winter night, on that same slow decoction. A handful of sliced root or stripped bark, set in a pot of water at the edge of the fire, and left to simmer down for an hour or more, gave up its strength into a dark, earthy, often bitter liquor, strained off and given warm, sweetened with honey to make it go down. It was patient work, and it filled the house with deep and rooty smells, and it was the characteristic medicine making of the cold months, when the quick infusion of a summer leaf had given way to the long, slow boiling of a winter root. The bag of roots and barks was tested and kept like everything else, though it forgave a little more. A well-dried root held its virtue a year or two, and even 3, but not forever, and the good wife judged an old root by its smell and its snap, throwing out any that had gone soft, or mouldy, or scentless, and digging fresh in the autumn to renew the store. Kept dry and dark and safe from the mouse, the bag saw a family through the winter, and a good store of it, laid in during the autumn, was one of the surest signs of a household, well prepared for the cold and the illness the cold always brought. We will draw the string of the root bag close now, and push it back into its dark corner, its earthy strength safe against the winter. And we will turn to the smallest and most enduring store of all, kept in a little box or a twist of cloth, tiny and hard, and full of a whole year's promise. Medicine and next year's harvest at once. Let us turn now to the box of seeds. Somewhere on the shelf, in a small box divided into compartments, or in a row of little stoppered pots, or simply in a handful of twists of cloth and paper, the household kept its seeds, and these were, of everything in the whole store, the longest keeping of all. A seed is nature's own way of holding a plant's virtue safe through the dead of winter, hard and dry and patient. And what keeps a seed alive for the spring keeps its medicine sound as well. A good store of seeds, kept dry and safe, held its strength for years, and so the seed box was the steadiest and most reliable corner of the whole medicine shelf, the least likely to fail a family in its need. The greatest company of the seed box were the warm, aromatic seeds that eased the stomach and the wind, and every household kept as many of them as it could. Caraway and fennel, anise and dill, coriander and cumin, all of them sharp and fragrant and warming, were the classic remedies for a troubled digestion, for the griping wind and colic that followed a heavy or a hurried meal, and for the sour, uneasy stomach. Chewed on their own, or steeped into a warm water, or boiled a little and the liquor drunk, these seeds settled the gut and eased the wind, and they were as much a part of the end of a good meal as of the medicine shelf. Indeed, the household had a way of taking them that made the medicine into a small pleasure. The seeds were coated in sugar or honey, layer upon patient layer, into little sweets the old books call comfits, and a dish of these was set out after a rich meal to be nibbled, sweet and spiced and settling to the stomach all at once. To take a few comfits after supper was to take a gentle digestive medicine in the pleasantest possible form, and in the finer households a dish of them was a small mark of comfort and hospitality, the sweet and the physic joined in one. Fennel and anise held a particular double virtue that made them dear to households with young children. Beyond settling the stomach, both were long believed to help a nursing mother's milk to flow, and a mother short of milk was given fennel water and anise to drink. The same fennel water, mild and sweet, was given by the spoonful to a colicky, crying infant to ease the wind in its little belly, a use so old and so widespread that it has never entirely died out. A household with a new baby kept fennel close, for the mother and the child alike. Caraway found its way into the daily bread, and the cheese as much as into the medicine, and there too it did its quiet work, for bread and cheese seasoned with caraway were thought to sit more kindly on the stomach and to ease the wind. Coriander and cumin, warming and aromatic, settled the gut and were carried, in the spice, owning households from the cooking pot to the sickbed and back without any sense that they had crossed a boundary. Here, more clearly than almost anywhere, the seed box showed how completely food and physic were one and the same thing in the medieval home. Chewed slowly on their own, the aromatic seeds did one more small service, freshening a stale mouth and sweetening the breath. A few grains of anise or fennel or caraway, taken after a meal of onions or strong meat, cleaned the mouth and left it fragrant, and this small courtesy, half hygiene and half medicine, was one more reason a little dish of seeds was kept always within reach at the table's end. The same seeds that eased the stomach also sweetened the mouth above it, doing double duty in the pleasantest possible way. Mustard seed held a fiercer place, and a very different one. Ground and mixed with a little water or flour into a paste. Mustard raised heat and a stinging warmth wherever it was laid on the skin, and this made it the household's great drawing plaster. Spread on a cloth and laid on the chest, a mustard plaster was used to ease a deep and congested cough, drawing the blood and the warmth to the surface and loosening the tightness beneath. Laid on an aching joint or a stiff and painful back, it did the same warming, easing work. And a handful of mustard stirred into a bowl of hot water made a mustard bath for cold and aching feet, warming a chilled body from the soles upward, a homely comfort on a bitter night. The seed box held gentler things for the night as well. The seeds of the poppy and of the wild lettuce were kept in careful households for their power to soothe pain and to bring on a heavy, needful sleep, given with real caution and respect, for the household knew well that what eased in a small measure could harm in a large one. Steeped into a mild drink, they quieted a body kept awake by pain. And a mother watching over a child who could not rest for hurting might, with care, reach for such a thing. These were among the most powerful of the seed box's contents, and among the most carefully handled. Linseed, the seed of the flax, gave the household one of its softest and most soothing remedies. Boiled in water, it gave up a thick, slippery liquid, and this linseed tea, sweetened with a little honey, was drunk for a harsh cough and a raw chest, coating and calming all the way down. The same crushed seed, mixed warm into a poultice, was laid on the chest to ease congestion, and on swellings and boils to soften and draw them, and fenugreek seed served in much the same way. Between the fierce heat of mustard and the gentle softness of linseed, the seed box held a whole range of poultices for the troubled chest, from the drawing to the soothing. There were soothing seeds, too, for the other of the body's troubles. The seeds of the quince, and of the plant the old herbals called fleawort for the look of its tiny dark seeds, swelled in water into a soft, slippery jelly, and this was given to ease a bound and costive belly, and to calm an inflamed and griping gut. Gentle and slow in their working, they were among the kindest of the household's remedies for the sluggish bowel, softening where a harsher purge would have torn, and a small store of them lay in the box for exactly those slow, uncomfortable troubles that afflicted the ill-fed and the long bedridden. In the great households, the taking of the spiced seeds at the close of a meal grew into a small ceremony of its own. A dish of comfits and candied seeds, sometimes with a cup of spiced wine, was brought out after supper had been cleared away, and this was thought to help the heavy meal settle and to sweeten the breath before the company parted for the night. What was a plain digestive remedy in the cottage became, in the manor and the hall, a graceful custom of hospitality, but the root of it was the same in both, the old and simple knowledge that a few warm, aromatic seeds ease the stomach after eating and send a body more comfortably to its bed. There was, in the seed box, a quiet doubleness that pleased the thrifty household heart, for the very same seeds that were medicine were also the next year's crop. A pinch of fennel or caraway or coriander was a remedy today, and a row of new plants come spring, and the household that saved its seeds saved its garden and its medicine shelf together in one small act. Nothing else on the shelf carried the future in it quite so plainly. To keep the seed box full was to keep faith with the coming year, to hold in a handful of tiny hard grains both the cure for tonight's colic and the promise of next summer's whole green harvest. The seeds asked only to be kept dry and safe. Damp would spoil them, and the mouse would eat them given half a chance, and so they were kept in tight little boxes and stoppered pots up out of reach, checked now and then and stirred to keep them sweet. And when a seed was wanted for medicine, it was often ground fresh in the little mortar just before using, for a seed crushed fresh gave up far more of its warm, aromatic virtue than one long ground and gone stale. The sound of the pestle in the mortar, grinding a spoon of seeds for a stomach remedy or a cough poultice, was one of the small, familiar sounds of the household evening. We will close the little seed box now, with its rows of tiny hard grains, safe against the winter and the spring alike, and turn from the things that were swallowed and steep to the things that bound and covered them, the plain cloth and simple apparatus of care kept folded in a chest apart. Let us turn now to the chest of cloths and bindings. Not everything the household kept for the sick was a remedy to be swallowed or spread. A good part of it was the plain apparatus of care, the cloths and bindings and simple tools without which the honey and the salves and the decoctions could not be brought to the body at all. These were kept, in most houses, in a chest or a covered basket set a little apart, and though there was nothing in it to taste or smell, this store was as needful as any crock on the shelf, for it was the means by which all the rest was applied. At the heart of it lay clean linen, and we must pause to remember how precious that was. Every scrap of cloth in a medieval house had been grown as flax or hemp, retted and beaten and combed, spun by hand into thread, and woven slowly into cloth, a labor of countless patient hours. Nothing so dearly made was ever thrown away. A sheet worn thin with years was not discarded but saved, cut down, and kept for the sick room, where soft worn, much washed linen was exactly what was wanted for a wound or a fevered brow. The rag bag and the chest of old linen were in this way a real part of the household's medicine, a slow accumulation of the softest and most useful cloth against the day it would be needed. From this store came the bandages, or clouts as they were often called, torn into strips from old sheeting, rolled up, and kept ready to bind a dressing in place, to hold a poultice against the skin, or to strap a wrenched joint. A well-run household kept a supply of them rolled and waiting, so that when a hurt came there was no fumbling for cloth, only the reaching into the chest for a roll already prepared. To bind well, neither too tight nor too loose, was a skill in itself, learned young, and the neat binding of a wound was a small point of pride to the woman who did it. Finer still was the lint, the soft down scraped up from a piece of old linen with the edge of a knife until a little heap of fluff was gathered. This soft lint was laid directly into and over a wound, gentle against the raw flesh, soaking up what wept from it and holding a salve close against it. The scraping of lint was a quiet task, often given to those who could do little else. An old grandmother by the fire, a child kept in, patiently working up a little store of softness for the next hurt. Beside the fine lint lay the coarser tow, the rough combings of the flax, used for the rougher dressings and to bulk out a poultice. The chest held the linen of birth as well, kept clean and ready against a coming childbed, the sheets and the swaddling bands, and the soft cloths for the new child. In a household expecting a baby, this childbed linen was got ready well ahead, washed and folded and set apart, for a birth was the one certain great event for which a household could truly prepare, and the readying of the linen was part of the long, quiet waiting for it. How much of this soft old linen a household had depended, like everything else, on its wealth. A prosperous house had presses full of napery and could spare worn sheets freely for the sick room. The poorest cottage had barely cloth enough to cover its beds and its backs, and a bad wound or a long illness could strip it of what little it had, every scrap given over to bandage and dressing until there was nothing left to spare. In such houses a length of clean linen was itself a kind of wealth, borrowed between neighbors in a crisis and returned when it could be, and the lack of it was one of the quiet hardships of being poor and ill at the same time. Cloth served the sick in warmth as well as in binding. A cloth wrung out in a hot decoction of herbs and laid steaming on an aching place, renewed as it cooled, made what the old books called a fomentation, carrying the warmth and the virtue of the herbs deep into a painful joint or a congested chest or a cramping belly. Between the cold vinegar cloth for a fever and the hot herb cloth for an ache, the household's plain linen became the carrier of both heat and cold, to wherever the body needed it, a simple and endlessly useful thing. For broken and injured limbs the chest gave up its slings and its bindings, and the household found its splints where it could, a smooth length of wood, a strip of stiff leather or bark, bound firm with cloth to hold a broken bone steady while it knit. A sling of folded linen to rest a broken arm, a firm binding to steady a cracked rib. These were the plain first aid of a world, without any hospital to run to, done at home with what the chest and the woodpile could provide. Some households kept, too, the tools of the older bleeding medicine, and we should speak of these calmly, as the ordinary practice they once were. Cupping glasses or cupping horns, warmed and set on the skin to draw the blood to the surface, were used to ease congestion and pain, and were kept, in some homes, among the sickroom things. The letting of a little blood was widely believed to right an imbalance in the body and to ward off illness, and a household of any means might keep the small blade for it and the basin to catch it, though the actual bleeding was often left to someone with a steadier reputation for it. These practices, strange as they seem to us now, were simply part of the accepted medicine of the age, done with care and full belief. There was, in many homes, a small jar of leeches as well, kept in clean water and changed often, ready to be set on the skin to draw blood from a particular place. The leech was the gentlest tool of the bleeding art, drawing slowly and locally, and it was used for all manner of swellings and congestions and aches. To keep leeches was a small responsibility of its own, and the leech jar, sitting quietly in a cool corner, was a common enough feature of a well-provided medieval household. The better equipped houses kept the apparatus of the inner cleansing too. The syringe the old books called a clister or glister, for the giving of the soothing and purging enemas that were a mainstay of the medicine of the day. A bound or a fevered patient was often treated first by clearing the bowel, and the household that owned the means to do it kept them clean and ready with the rest of the sickroom gear. It was homely, unglamorous work, and it was done without embarrassment, as one more of the plain services the well cared for the sick. Running through all of this was an instinct toward cleanliness that the age could not have explained, but plainly felt. The cloths of the sickroom were washed, boiled in the great pot, dried, and kept clean, and though no one knew of the small living things that a clean cloth kept from a wound, the practice of using soft, clean, well-washed linen did real good all the same. The careful goodwife who would not lay a dirty cloth on an open wound was doing, by instinct and long custom, something that later ages would learn to do by knowledge, and her wounded charges were the better for it. The chest of cloths was, more than any other part of the store, the work of the household's women made visible. The spinning and the weaving, the sewing and the washing, and the careful saving of every worn scrap were women's work, done in the margins of every other task, and the chest that held its slow harvest was theirs to keep and theirs to draw on. When we picture the medicine shelf, we picture the crocks and the bundles, but behind them, quiet and essential, stood this chest of cloth, the patient product of 1,000 hours at the wheel and the loom, waiting to bind and cushion and warm whatever hurt the household next. The old wills and inventories show how genuinely this cloth was valued. Sheets and coverlets and lengths of linen are listed and left by name, bequeathed carefully from mother to daughter, counted among a household's real goods. Cloth that we would think nothing of was, to them, a possession worth recording and passing on, and the same care that hoarded it for the marriage bed hoarded its worn remnants for the sick bed. In the soft, much mended linen of the care chest lay years of a family's labor and a family's thrift, saved and saved again, and turned at the last to the gentlest of uses. There is a plain tenderness in that chest of soft old linen when you think on it. Every cloth in it had once been something else, a sheet slept in for years, a shirt worn soft, a cloth used daily until it wore thin, and now it waited, clean and folded, for the moment it would be torn or scraped or wrung out to ease someone's hurt. The very softness that made it useful was the softness of long use, and there is something fitting in that, the worn and gentle things of a household's life kept back, at the last, to comfort its wounds. We will close the lid on the chest of cloths now, its rolled bandages and soft lint, and folded childbed linen waiting in the dark, and turn to a stranger and older kind of medicine, one that hung not on the shelf but above the door, and guarded the household against troubles no salve could reach. Let us turn now to the charm above the door. Above the door of a great many medieval homes, fixed to the lintel or nailed to the frame, hung something that the household counted among its medicine, as surely as the honey or the herbs, though we would call it by another name. A charm, a token, a guard against harm, it hung where everyone who entered must pass beneath it, and it was there to protect the house and all within it from the illnesses and misfortunes whose causes no one could see. To understand it we must set aside, gently, our own way of dividing the world, for the medieval mind drew no firm line between the medicine that healed a body and the charm that guarded it from harm in the first place. Illness, to that world, did not come only from bad air or bad food, or an imbalance of the humours. It might come, too, from ill will, from the envious glance, from unseen spirits, from a fortune turned sour, and against these a poultice was no use at all. What was needed was protection, and the household provided it as carefully as it provided its salves and syrups, with objects and words and small rituals kept about the house, and above all at the door, where the outside world crossed into the safe inner one. The charm above the door was, in the truest sense of that age, preventive medicine, guarding the health of the household before any illness could take hold. The iron horseshoe was among the commonest of these guards, nailed above the door with its ends pointing upward, so the luck should not run out of it. Iron itself was widely held to have a protective virtue, a metal that unseen harms could not easily cross, and a horseshoe, being iron, and also a thing of the honest working horse, carried a double strength. Many a cottage door wore one, red with rust and long forgotten in its meaning by later generations, who kept nailing them up all the same, because it had always been done. The rowan tree gave another guard, so trusted against harm that it earned the old name of witch wood. A small cross of 2 rowan twigs bound with red thread, hung over the door or the bed, or carried on the person, was believed to turn aside ill will and to keep the house and its beasts from harm. Sprigs of rowan were set above the byre, as well as the house, for the health of the animals was as dear as that of the family, and a rowan growing beside the door was, in many regions, a tree never cut down, kept and valued for the quiet protection it was thought to give. Living plants stood guard too. Elder grew beside a great many doors, respected and a little feared, thought to keep harm from the threshold it shaded. The house leek clung to the roof itself, planted in the thatch or the tiles, and the old belief held that a roof so planted would not be struck by lightning in a storm, so that the little rosettes overhead were as much a guard for the house as a remedy for a burn. These plants of protection blurred, once again, the line the age never really drew, being medicine and guard and household companion all at once, where the guard was made of words rather than of iron or wood. the household turned to the written charm. A few words of prayer, or a string of holy names, or an old array of letters whose meaning had long since been forgotten, was written on a scrap of parchment, folded small, and either worn against the skin in a little pouch or fixed up in the house to guard it. Some of these charms were arrangements of letters passed down for centuries, believed to hold power in their very shape, and though few who kept them could have explained them, they were copied and folded and trusted all the same, a quiet inheritance of protective words. The faith of the church wove all through this and gave the household its own blessed guards. A small vessel of holy water might stand near the door, for the crossing and the blessing of those who came and went, and for sprinkling about the house against harm. Palm crosses from the spring feast, candles blessed at candlemas, small medals and images of the saints, and sprigs of herbs blessed in church on certain holy days, all of these were kept about the home as guards of its health and its peace. The herbs gathered and blessed at midsummer, around the feast of St. John, were held especially potent and were hung up to protect the house through the year to come. Much of this protection was aimed at the envious eye, the look of ill will that a neighbor, even without meaning it, might cast on a thriving child or a fine young beast. Against it the household kept small guards, a bit of red thread tied about a baby's wrist, a piece of coral hung at its neck, a quick word or a sign made when a stranger admired the children too warmly. A healthy, pretty child was thought to be especially at risk from such a glance, and a careful mother guarded hers with these small tokens as naturally as she wrapped it against the cold. None of it was thought strange. It was simply part of keeping a child well in a world of unseen dangers. Bread and salt, the plainest things of the table, carried a protective meaning too, offered to a guest or kept about the house as tokens of good faith and good fortune of a household ordered and blessed. Here, more than anywhere, the ordinary and the sacred, the food and the God, ran together, so that the same salt that seasoned the pot and gargled the throat also, in its way, watched over the peace of the home. The guarding did not stop at the family. The health of the beasts was the health of the household, for a sick cow or a dead pig could mean hunger in the winter, and so the byre and the stable were hung with their own guards, sprigs of rowan and elder, a holy token, a charm against the souring of the milk or the sickening of the herd. On certain days the animals themselves were blessed, sprinkled with holy water, or passed by the smoke of blessed herbs, and the same herbs that fumigated a sick room were burned in the byre to keep the beasts in health. The whole homestead, people and animals together, was watched over by the same web of small protections. The door itself, the threshold where the safe inside met the uncertain outside, drew more of these customs than any other part of the house. It was a place of crossing, and crossings were held to be moments of danger and of luck at once, so the door was where the horseshoe hung and the holy water stood, where a guest was met with bread and salt. To pass beneath the charm on the lintel each time one came in from the fields or the dark was to be quietly reminded that here was safety, here was home. Here was the guarded place, and that in itself was no small comfort at the end of a hard day. None of this was thought to be at odds with the herbs on the shelf or the salves in their crocks. The household used all of it together, without any sense of contradiction, binding a wound with honey and a clean cloth, and speaking a blessing over it in the same breath, giving a fevered child a cooling draught, and hanging a fresh sprig of blessed herb above its bed. The remedy and the charm were two hands of the same care, and the household reached with both. It would be a mistake to think the household lived in constant fear of these unseen harms. For the most part the charms were kept and renewed almost without thought, the way a thing is done because it has always been done. A horseshoe nailed up, a sprig of rowan replaced, a blessing quietly spoken. Small habits woven so deep into the fabric of the day that they asked no belief and stirred no dread. They were simply part of keeping house, as ordinary as sweeping the floor or banking the fire, and they gave, in their quiet way, the same plain reassurance that a tidy hearth and a full shelf gave, the sense of a home in order and at peace. We may see, from our distance, that the charm above the door healed nothing that a modern eye would recognize. But it is worth seeing, too, what it truly gave. It gave the household a sense that something stood between it and the dark, that the frightening and the unseen could be met and guarded against, that there was always something more to be done. And that steadying of the frightened heart, that quieting of the dread that walked with every illness in an age that understood so little of it, was itself a real and gentle medicine, perhaps the oldest of them all. We will leave the charm hanging quietly above the door now, its iron or its rowan, or its folded words keeping their long watch over the threshold, and turn to the plain question of where. In a house without any cold cellar or sealed jar, all of this was actually kept, and how it was made to last. Let us turn now to the cool larder and the keeping of things. We have taken a great many things down from the shelf tonight, and named them, and set them back. Let us turn now to the plain question that lay beneath all of them, the question the household faced every single day, and answered without ever quite putting it into words. In a house with no cold cellar, no sealed glass, no way at all to keep the cold in or the air out as we would understand it, how did any of this last from one season to the next? How was a summer's gathering made to serve a winter's need? The answer lay in the cool larder, and in the whole patient art of keeping that the household practiced without ever calling it by a name. The larder itself was the coolest corner the house could offer. In a better house it was a small room of its own, set on the shady northern side, its walls thick, its floor of stone or beaten earth that held the chill of the ground, its one small window unglazed and screened to let the cool air move, but keep the light and the flies out. In a cottage it might be no more than a shaded nook away from the fire, a stone slab in the coolest corner, a cupboard against the north wall. Wherever it was, its purpose was the same, to hold the perishable stores in the steadiest, coolest, darkest air the household could contrive, and so to slow the spoiling that warmth and light and damp always hurried on. For the household understood its enemies well, even if it could not name the small living causes behind them. Heat spoiled things, and so the perishable stores were kept cool. Light faded and weakened them, and so they were kept dark. Air turned fats rancid and let mood take hold, and so crocks were stopped close. Damp was the worst of all, softening and rotting and breeding the grey and green moulds that ruined a store, and so dryness was guarded above everything. And the vermin, the mouse and the moth and the weevil, ate and fouled whatever they could reach, and so a constant, patient war was waged to keep them out. Against these five, heat and light and air and damp and vermin, the whole art of keeping was arrayed. Damp was the enemy the household feared most, and against it the fire itself was the great ally. Dried herbs, seeds, and roots, the things that had to stay dry to keep their virtue, were stored in the driest, warmest reach of the house, near the chimney or up in the smoky roof, where the rising heat of the hearth held the wet at bay. A herb that grew damp grew mouldy, and a mouldy herb was worse than none, and so the good wife kept her drying stores well away from the cool, moist air of the larder that sweeted the crocks of fat and the flasks of water. The house, in this way, held two climates at once: the warm, dry roof for the herbs and seeds, the cool larder for the perishable rest, and a careful woman knew exactly which store belonged in which. The sealing of the crocks was an art in itself. A crock of salve or conserve, once filled, was closed against the air that would spoil it, its mouth covered with a round of waxed cloth or parchment, or with a piece of bladder softened and tied down tight, or sealed with a layer of melted fat or wax poured over the top to shut the air out entirely. A well-sealed crock kept its contents sound far longer than an open one, and the household that sealed carefully in the autumnate and dosed well through the winter, while the careless one found its stores gone bad before the cold was half over. Some of the stores, of course, needed no such guarding, and these were the backbone of the shelf for exactly that reason. Honey kept almost forever of its own nature, and salt and vinegar, and the things preserved in them. This was no accident of the household's choosing. The very substances it leaned on most heavily were the ones that lasted, chosen across long generations precisely because they did not spoil, so that the heart of the medicine shelf was made of keeping things, and only the salves and waters and fresh made remedies needed the larder's care to see them through. The war against the vermin never ended. The mouse would gnaw into a bag of seeds or a store of dried root given the smallest chance. The moth would ruin the woolens and the drying herbs. The weevil would spoil the meal. Against them the household set the cat, and tight-lidded crocks, and high shelves out of reach, and the strong-smelling herbs, wormwood and tansy and southernwood, laid among the stores to drive the pests away. It was a war never quite won, only held to a standstill season by season, and a store found fouled by mice was one of the small, wearing griefs of keeping a house. Mood was the quiet spoiler that crept in when damp got past the guard. A salve gone rancid, a herb gone grey and musty, a conserve furred over with green, all of these were watched for and, when found, thrown out without hesitation, for the household knew by long instinct that a spoiled remedy was no remedy but a harm. The smell was the great test, as it was for everything on the shelf, and the good wife's nose, trained across a lifetime, judged what was still sound, and what had turned, sparing the good and condemning the bad with a confidence no book could have given her. Over all of this ran the great turning rhythm of the year, which we have touched on before and may now see whole. The shelf and the larder filled in the autumn, at harvest and slaughter, when the year's gathering and rendering and preserving crowded the house with new stores. Through the winter they were drawn steadily down, crock by crock and bundle by bundle, until by the lean weeks of early spring the larder stood nearly empty, and the household waited, watchful, for the first green things to rise. Then the whole patient cycle began again, gathering and drying and steeping and sealing through the warm months, laying up once more against the cold. The medicine shelf breathed with the seasons, full and thin, and full again, in time with the turning of the whole year. And because the stores were laid down in this rhythm, the household used them in their turn, oldest first, so that nothing was left to spoil while newer stores were opened. The good wife carried in her head not only what she had and where, but how old each thing was, and she reached for the oldest sound crock before the newer one, drawing her stores down in the order she had laid them up. This quiet rotation, kept entirely by memory, was one more of the countless small disciplines that made the difference between a household that wasted nothing and one that found its stores gone bad before their time. There were no written labels on any of it, as we have said, and yet nothing was ever truly lost or forgotten. The order of the crocks, the feel of a particular jar, a knot tied in a certain way, a thread of a certain color, the plain long memory of the hands that had filled them, all of these stood in for the written word, and served just as well. A stranger set loose in that larder would have found only a puzzle of unmarked crocks. The woman who kept it moved among them in the dark with perfect certainty, and could have told you of any one of them, what it held and when it was made and how much was left. Some things the household simply could not keep, and knew it, and worked around the lack. Fresh green herbs faded in a day, fresh milk sawed by the next, fresh fruit rotted within the week. And so the whole art of the store was really the art of turning the unkeepable into the keepable, the fresh herb into the dried bundle, the fresh milk into the keeping cheese, the fresh fruit into the crock of honeyed conserve. What could not be held in its own nature was changed into a form that could be held. And in that changing lay the deepest craft of the medieval household, the quiet defeat of time and season that let a summer's plenty reach a winter's need. For the larder and the shelf together were, in the end, the household's insurance against the dark of the year, and against the illness the dark always brought. A full larder in autumn meant a family that would meet the winter fed and provided with something in reserve for every likely trouble. A thin one meant a hard road ahead, hunger and cold and sickness met with too little to meet them with. The old people judged a household's whole health and thrift by a glance at its stores, and they were seldom wrong, for the state of the larder was the state of the household's readiness for whatever the year might bring. There is something steadying in that picture of the cool, dim larder, its crocks sealed and ranged and known, its stores laid up in their season and drawn down in their turn, a whole quiet science of keeping practiced by people who could not read a word of it, passed hand to hand across the centuries. It asked no learning, only care and attention, and the long memory of the seasons, and it kept a family alive through winter after winter, in house after house, across the whole of the medieval world. We have seen the ordinary household store now, from the shelf by the fire to the cool larder that kept it. Let us turn now to a richer and more worldly version of the same thing, to a house in the town where the medicine was bought rather than gathered and kept behind a lock. Let us turn now to the burgher's cupboard in the townhouse. Leave the cottage now and the farmhouse, and follow a paved street into a town, to the tall narrow house of a prosperous burgher, a merchant or a master craftsman, a man of standing with money enough to live well. His household kept a medicine store like any other, but it was a store of a different kind, and the differences tell us a great deal about how medicine changed as one climbed from the cottage to the comfortable townhouse. Here, above all, the medicine was bought, for the townhouse had no dooryard garden crowded with herbs, no hedgerow at the lane's end, no common land to gather from. What a cottage grew and gathered, a town household bought, and it could afford to. And so the Burgher's store leaned less on the gathered herb, and the homemade salve and more on the finished remedy, purchased ready, made from the one great advantage the town held over the country, the shop of the apothecary. The apothecary was the town's true difference. In his shop, with its rows of jars and its scales, and its drawers of drugs, a household could buy almost anything its health required. The compound medicines it could never have made at home. The imported drugs it could never have grown. The finished syrups and conserves and pills weighed out and wrapped across the counter. To live near an apothecary was to have the whole world's medicine within a short walk, and the Burgher's household used it freely, sending a servant with a coin for whatever the family needed. The gathering and drying and steeping that filled a cottage year was, for the townhouse, largely replaced by the simple act of buying. At the heart of the Burgher's store stood a cupboard, and unlike the open shelf of the cottage, this one had a lock. A tall ombre of good wood, its door fitted with a key, held the household's medicines safe, and the key hung at the belt of the mistress of the house, who guarded the costly contents as she guarded the spice and the silver. That lock and key say much in themselves. Where the cottage kept its cheap and homely stores open on a shelf, the townhouse kept a store valuable enough to be worth locking away, and dangerous enough, in its stronger drugs, to be worth keeping from careless hands. Inside it stood the homely things still, the honey and the dried herbs and the salves, bought at market now rather than made. But beside them stood the finer stores the cottage never saw. Spices in real quantity, not a treasured pinch, but a good store of pepper and ginger and cinnamon and cloves, and sugar, that costly import from the warm lands, which the town house could afford and the cottage could not, and which slowly took the place of honey in the finest of the syrups and conserves, prized both as a sweetness and as a medicine in its own right, folded into cordials and lozenges, and the smooth conserves of flowers and fruit that a wealthy household loved. Chief among the bought remedies stood the great compound medicines, and grandest of all was the one the old books called treacle, or theriac, or Venice treacle for the city famous for making the best of it. This was a costly confection of many dozens of ingredients, herbs and roots and spices and more, blended and aged for months, and sold as a cure, all against poison, plague, fever, and a host of other ills. A pot of good theriac was among the most prized medicines a household could own, dear and famous, and trusted across all of Europe, and its cousin Mithridate, another grand compound of many parts, stood beside it. No cottage could dream of such things. The Burgher bought them from the apothecary and kept them under lock as the treasures they were. The cupboard held, too, the imported drugs that came from the far ends of the trade routes, the strong purges and physics that a serious illness called for. The root of rhubarb, carried all the way from the east, prized as a gentle cleanser of the body. Senna and aloes and cassia, the great purging drugs of the age, bought in small costly amounts and given with care. These were the strong medicine of the learned physic, and the town household, close to the apothecary and able to pay, kept and used them where the country household never could, leaning instead on its gentler homegrown purges. As the years went on, the townhouse came to keep something else the cottage almost never had: the printed book. A herbal, its pages naming and picturing the plants and their virtues; an almanac, a book of receipts for medicines and cordials and conserves. All of these found their way onto the shelves of the literate, comfortable household, and the mistress who could read gathered her knowledge from the page, as well as from her mother. Recipes were copied out, traded between friends, sent in letters from one household to another, and a well-kept receipt book, filled in a careful hand across the years, became a treasured possession, handed down like any other family good. The townhouse kept its medicines in finer vessels, too, than the cottage ever saw. Glazed pots and glass bottles, pewter measures and boxes of turned wood, gave the burgher's cupboard a neat and ordered look, each conserve and syrup and water in its proper container, sometimes even marked with a written label in a household that could read. Where the cottage knew its unmarked crocks, by feel and by memory, the townhouse could afford to keep its stores labelled and ranged like a small apothecary's shop of its own, a little image on the household's own shelves of the trade that supplied them. The burgher could buy advice as well as medicine. Where the cottage met its illnesses with the shelf, and the wise woman, the town household, in a grave sickness, could send for a physician, a learned man who had studied the medicine of the schools, and pay him for his judgment. He might prescribe, and the apothecary might make up what he ordered, and the two together, the physician and the apothecary, gave the wealthy town family a whole apparatus of professional care that the countryside simply did not have within reach. Medicine, for the burgher, was a thing one could buy at every stage: the drug, the advice, the making up, all of it available for coin. Yet for all its fine and bought and locked away stores, the townhouse never quite left the old homely medicine behind. The honey and the vinegar still stood in the kitchen. The familiar herbs, bought now at the market stall from the country women who brought them in, still hung and steeped and simmered. The bedtime posset was still made, the fevered brow still cooled with a vinegar cloth, the child's cough still eased with an electuary of honey. The burgher's cupboard added the world's finer medicine to the household's own, but it did not replace it. And beneath the theriac and the sugar and the printed herbal ran the same ancient, homely store that every house in Europe kept. There was a shadow to the town's abundance, and the sober household knew it. Where medicine could be bought, medicine could be sold, and the towns had their share of costly nostrums and grand sounding cures that promised much and did little, pressed on the anxious and the wealthy by sellers with more confidence than knowledge. A wise mistress trusted the plain and proven things, the honey and the herbs, and the few good bought remedies she knew, and spent her coin carefully, and left the fashionable and the extravagant to those with more money than sense. The temptation to buy one's way to health was itself a small danger of the town, and the steady household resisted it. We may see, in the burgher's locked cupboard, a whole different way of standing toward one's own health, a way of buying rather than making, of trusting the shop and the physician rather than the garden and the grandmother. It was richer, and in serious illness it could do more, and it opened the whole world's medicine to those who could pay. But it had lost a little, too, of the deep, self-reliant knowledge of the cottage, the knowing of every plant and every making that came of gathering one's own. The town gained the apothecary and lost, by slow degrees, a little of the old craft, and both the gain and the loss are worth pausing on. We will lock the Burgher's cupboard now, and hang the key back at the mistress's belt, and leave the paved streets of the town for the open country once more, for a house that stood between the cottage and the town in its wealth and its ways, the deep and well-stocked store of a prosperous farm. Let us turn now to the Yeoman's farmhouse store. Between the bare shelf of the cottage and the locked cupboard of the town stood a third kind of household, and in many ways it kept the fullest and most self-sufficient medicine store of them all. This was the farmhouse of the prosperous yeoman, the farmer who held good land, kept servants and labourers, and lived in real plenty without ever being a townsman or a lord. His house had the land and the hands, and the time that the cottage lacked, and the country knowledge that the town had begun to lose. And out of the two together, it made a store of medicine as deep and as capable as any in the land. For the farmhouse could make almost everything it needed, and this was its great strength. Where the cottage gathered a little, and the Burgher bought much, the farmhouse grew, gathered, reared, rendered, distilled, and preserved on a scale that let it stock its shelves richly from its own ground. It had the garden and the orchard, the hedgerows and the fields, the beehives and the dairy and the beasts, and the servants to work them, and so the whole homemade medicine of the age lay within its reach without the need to buy a thing. The farmhouse store was the cottage store grown large and abundant. Wanting for nothing it could make itself. Often it had a proper still room, and this set it apart. A room given over to the making and keeping of the household's finer medicines, with its still and its crocks, and its ranks of bottles. The still room was the domain of the mistress of the house, where she distilled her waters, brewed her cordials, boiled her syrups and conserves, and stored the results in good order. To have a whole room for such work was a mark of real standing, and the farmhouse still room, fragrant and busy through the making seasons, was one of the quiet centres of the well-run country household. The farmhouse year had its great making seasons, and the still room kept them faithfully. When the roses were in full flower, there was rose water to distill and conserve of roses to pound and pot. When the elder bloomed, its flowers were gathered by the basketful for water, and for syrup, and for vinegar. At the gooseberry and the quince and the damson, at the gathering of the herbs and the pressing of the honey, the still room worked at its fullest, the mistress and her maids putting up the year's medicine and sweetmeats together in a round of fragrant, busy days. To keep such a still room well was to keep a whole calendar of makings in one's head, each in its proper season, and the farmhouse that did so wanted for nothing when the winter came. The mistress of that house was its physician in every real sense. She doctored not only her own family, but the whole household under her roof, the servants and the farm labourers, and any who fell ill in her care, and often the poorer neighbours besides. Her knowledge was wide and deep, gathered from her mother, tested across years, and equal to nearly every ordinary trouble that came her way, from a labourer's cut hand to a child's fever to a servant's winter cough. She was within her own small world, a figure of real authority in matters of health, and her standing rested squarely on the store she kept and the skill with which she used it. Much of that knowledge she kept in a book, and the farmhouse receipt book was among its greatest treasures, filled in over the years in a careful hand, and handed down from mother to daughter. It held the household's own recipes for medicines and cordials and conserves, gathered and tested and copied, added to and traded with friends and neighbours. To inherit such a book was to inherit a whole working knowledge of physic and preserving, and the finest of them, kept and added to across generations, grew into something close to a family's own private herbal, the distilled wisdom of a line of capable women. The farmhouse kept its stores in quantity, and this too set it apart. Where the cottage measured its honey in a single crock, and its herbs in a few small bundles, the farmhouse laid in casks and crocks and bunches by the dozen, enough to dose and feed a large household through the longest winter with plenty in reserve. Abundance was itself a kind of medicine, for a house with full stores met illness unafraid, able to make freely whatever a sickness called for without counting every spoonful, and the labourers and servants of a well-provided farm were the healthier for the depth of its shelves. The dairy gave the farmhouse a whole class of remedies the cottage and the town both lacked. Whey, the thin liquid left from the making of cheese, was drunk as a cooling, cleansing drink for fevers and for the blood. Buttermilk soothed and cooled. Fresh cream and butter were spread on burns and chapped skin. The dairy, in this way, was a kind of pharmacy in its own right, and the farmhouse that made its own cheese and butter had, as a matter of course, a steady supply of these gentle dairy medicines that no one without a cow could easily come by. The finer remedies that the burgher bought, the farmhouse simply made. Cordials of many herbs, conserves of flowers and fruit, syrups and candied roots and distilled waters. All of these came out of the still room rather than off the apothecary's counter, made at home from the household's own ground and stored in its own bottles. The farmhouse reached the same finer end of medicine as the town house, but by making rather than buying, and it kept, in the making, the deep hands on knowledge that buying slowly erodes. The farm doctored its beasts as carefully as its people, and their medicine shared the same store. A sick cow, a lame horse, a pig off its feed, an ailing flock, all of these were the farmer's concern and often his livelihood, and the household kept its remedies for them alongside its own. The drenches and salves and washes of the byre and the stable, the lore of animal healing, the farrier's and the herdsman's knowledge, ran alongside the mistress's physic, and the same herbs and fats and roots that served the family served the beasts, for on a farm the health of the animals and the health of the people were bound together past, all separating. Around this deep and capable household gathered the neighbourhood's need. The poorer cottagers nearby, lacking stores of their own, came to the farmhouse door in their troubles, and the mistress gave what she could, a salve, a cordial, a handful of some dried herb, an afternoon's care by a sickbed. This charity was expected of a household of her standing, and it was given as a matter of course, and it made the farmhouse a kind of local wellspring of medicine, a place the whole small community turned to when its own bare shelves ran short. The farm's abundance overflowed, in this quiet way, into the health of everyone around it. The farmhouse bought a little, of course. A journey to a market town or a great fair brought back the spices and the few drugs the household could not make. The pepper and ginger, the treacle for the worst emergencies, a store of sugar as the years went on. But these purchases were the smaller part of its medicine, added to a store that was overwhelmingly its own making. And the farmhouse never depended on the shop as the town house did. It bought what it could not grow, and grew or made all the rest, and in that balance lay its particular strength. There is a real dignity in that deep and self-reliant store, the fullest flowering of the household medicine we have followed all night. It owed nothing to any shop, and little to any book, beyond the one the mistress kept herself. It grew from the land and the labor of a single farm, gathered and made and stored by knowing hands, and it met the whole health of a large household, people and beasts and needy neighbors alike, out of its own abundance. If we wish to see the household medicine of the age at its confident best, we would look here to the well-stocked still room and the deep crocks and the handed down book of a prosperous country farm. We will leave the farmhouse now, its still-room shelves crowded and fragrant, its receipt book closed on the table, and go down at last to the humblest home of all, the bare cottage of the landless poor, and see what medicine a family kept when it had almost nothing at all. Let us turn now to the cottager's single shelf. Down at the bottom of the whole long ladder we have been climbing stood the poorest home of all, the cottage of the landless laborer, the family that held no land beyond a scrap of garden and lived by the work of its hands. Here the medicine store shrank to almost nothing, and yet it was still a store, still a defense against the dark, and in its very bareness it tells us something the fuller shelves cannot. It shows us the true, irreducible heart of the household medicine, the few things a family kept, when it could keep almost nothing at all. On such a shelf there might be no more than 3 or 4 things. A little honey, if the family kept a skep of bees, or could trade for a small crock of it. A dish of salt, which no household could do without. A bundle or 2 of dried herbs from the scrap of dooryard, chamomile perhaps, or mint, or whatever grew most willingly by the door. A small pot of saved fat for a salve. And that, very often, was all. The whole medicine store of a poor family might have fit in a single pair of cupped hands, and it held nothing bought, nothing costly, nothing from the far ends of the world. For the cottager had no coin for the apothecary, and no spice, and no sugar, and no fine distilled waters or grand bought cures. The whole world of purchased medicine that the burgher kept behind his lock was simply closed to the poor, as far beyond their reach as the physician's fee or the printed book. What they could not gather or make with their own hands, they mostly did without. And their medicine was, of necessity, the very cheapest and homeliest of all, drawn almost entirely from what the land gave for free. Even the poorest cottage usually had its scrap of ground by the door, and into it the family crowded what few plants it most relied on. A little chamomile, some mint, a root of comfrey, a clump of feverfew, planted close by the threshold where they could be reached in a moment and tended in an odd spare hour. This dooryard patch was the cottager's whole garden and whole physic garden at once, tiny and crowded and precious, and the few plants in it were chosen with the sure knowledge of a family that could grow only a handful and had to choose the most useful of all. Nothing was grown there for beauty or for idleness. Every plant earned its small place by its use. And so the true medicine store of the poor was not the shelf at all, but the hedgerow, the wayside, and the common. What they could not afford to buy and had no room to grow, they gathered wild in its season. From the ground that belonged to no one, the nettle and the plantain, the elder and the dock, the wayside herbs that were free to any hand that knew them. The poor could not keep large stores, for they had neither the crocks nor the room, nor the surplus to lay much by, and so they leaned instead on gathering fresh, again and again, whatever the season offered, turning the whole surrounding countryside into a medicine store they did not have to keep. What they lacked in stores, they made up in the skill of gathering. And here they were often the true masters of the whole countryside's medicine. A cottage family walked the lanes and the wood, edges with knowing eyes, marking where the good stands of nettle and elder and plantain grew, when each came into its season, which bank held the first coltsfoot, and which ditch the best watercress. This gatherer's knowledge, carried in the head and passed from parent to child on the walk to the fields, was a real and valuable inheritance, and it turned the free and open land into a larder and a medicine shelf that no lock could bar and no poverty could empty. When even that fell short, the poor leaned on one another. A neighbor with honey to spare gave a little to the family that had none. A cottage with a good store of some herb shared it with the house next door in its need. This borrowing and sharing wove the poor households of a village into a single loose store, each family's small shelf part of a larger common one, and in a crisis the whole neighborhood's scant medicine could be gathered to a single sickbed. Poverty made the community itself into a kind of medicine chest, its stores scattered across a dozen bare shelves but reachable, in real need, all the same. And when the neighbors' shelves ran short too, there was the wise woman at the edge of the parish, who asked little or nothing, and the monastery gate, where the poor might be given remedies and care, and the charity of the manor and the farmhouse. The poorest household stood, in the end, at the center of a whole web of help beyond its own bare walls, and reached out along its threads when its own small store failed. The shelf was only the first and nearest of its defenses, and behind it lay the neighbor, the healer, the church, and the charitable hand. For all its bareness, though, the cottager's shelf held no less wisdom than the richest cupboard, only less goods. The poor knew their few plants deeply, more deeply, perhaps, than the wealthy who could afford to buy their way past ignorance. A cottage family that leaned its whole health on a dozen wild herbs knew those herbs as intimately as it knew its own children, where each grew, when to gather it, how to make it serve. What the poor lacked was never the knowledge. It was only the means to keep and to buy, and their knowledge, pressed into so few plants, was often the surer for it. There was a hard edge to this way of living, and the poor knew it well. A store gathered fresh and barely kept was a store easily lost, and a bad season, a wet summer that rotted the herbs, a hard winter come early, an illness that struck when the shelf was already bare, could leave a poor family with nothing at all to meet its troubles. The thin weeks of early spring, when the last of the winter stores had gone, and the new green had not yet risen, were the most dangerous of the whole year, and it was then, in the hungry gap, that sickness fell hardest on those with the least laid by. The cottager's shelf was a brave thing, but it was a fragile one, and it stood always a little closer to the dark than the fuller shelves above it. There is a plain truth at the bottom of the whole ladder, and it is worth resting on. The same honey healed a wound in the cottage and the castle. The same chamomile quieted a restless child, whether it was drunk from a horn cup or a silver one. The same salt gargled the same sore throats from the lowest hovel to the highest hall. The great remedies of the household medicine worked no differently for the rich than for the poor, and in that plain fact lay a kind of quiet justice. The poorest family, with its 4 things on a single shelf, held the same core of healing that the burgher kept behind his lock, only smaller, only bare, only gathered instead of bought. And so the cottager's single shelf, humble as it was not a lesser thing than the others, but the same thing reduced to its essence, the household medicine stripped down to what a family simply could not do without. Honey for a wound, salt for the throat and the pot, a herb or 2 for the fever and the belly, a little fat for a salve. From these few things, and the knowledge to use them, and the free gathering of the hedgerow, a poor family met the whole ordinary round of its illnesses, as its neighbours did, and as the great house on the hill did in its grander way, all of them drawing, in the end, on the same ancient store of homely healing. When all else failed the poor family, it fell back on the oldest medicine of all, and the cheapest, warmth and rest, and a little something warm to drink. A place by the fire, a covering of what few blankets the house could spare, a cup of warm small beer or a thin broth, and the patient waiting out of the illness. These cost nothing but care, and they were often, in truth, the greater part of any household's healing, rich or poor. The cottage that had almost no medicine still had this, the warmth of its own hearth and the care of its own people, and in a great many illnesses that was the medicine that mattered most of all. We have climbed the whole ladder now, from the locked cupboard of the town to the deep stores of the farm to this last bare shelf of the poor, and found, at every step, the same few faithful things at the heart of it. There is one thing more to see before the night draws in, one act that every household shared, rich and poor alike, when illness came in earnest, and it is the gentlest and most human of all. Let us turn now to the sick bowl and the broth pot. There was one shelf we have not yet visited, though in a sense we have circled it all night, and it was the one every household shared, from the barest cottage to the grandest hall. When illness came in earnest, when someone truly could not rise, and would not eat and lay weak and wretched in the bed, the medicine that mattered most was very often not a salve or a syrup at all, but a bowl of something warm and gentle and nourishing, coaxed patiently into a body that had refused everything else. The broth pot and the sick bowl were the true heart of the household's care, and to them we turn last of all. For a sick body will not take ordinary food. The heavy bread, the salt meat, the coarse pottage of a working household sat like stones in a fevered stomach, and so the care of the sick called for a cookery of its own, thin, warm, mild, and tempting, made to slip down an unwilling throat and to nourish a body too weak for anything stronger. This sick cookery was one of the oldest and most important of all the household arts, and every capable woman knew its small dishes as surely as she knew her salves and her simples, for feeding the sick was, very often, the whole of what healing them required. First among these gentle foods was barley water, that ancient and cooling drink reached for in every fever. Barley was set to boil long and slow in a good deal of water, until the grain gave up its softness and its goodness into the liquid, and then the water was strained off, sometimes sweetened with a little honey, sometimes sharpened with a touch of lemon in the households that could get it, and given cool to the feverish to drink. It quenched the terrible thirst of a fever, it cooled and soothed, and it carried a little nourishment into a body that could take nothing solid, and it had done all this unchanged since the medicine of the ancient world. Close beside it stood the gruels, the thin porridges that were the very staple of the sick room. Water, gruel, made of oatmeal or barley, meal stirred into water and simmered thin, was the plainest of them, given to the weakest patients, and a richer gruel, made with a little milk or broth and sweetened and spiced, was given as strength began to return. Thin enough to be almost drunk, warm and bland and easy. Gruel was the food a household reached for when a sick person could keep down nothing more, and many a life was carried through a long illness on little else but a steady succession of warm gruels, spooned patiently through the worst of it. For the very weak, and for sick children, there was panada, bread boiled soft in water, or in a light broth, until it fell into a smooth, mild pap, enriched sometimes with a little butter, a beaten egg, a scrape of nutmeg. Warm, soft, and nourishing, needing almost no strength to swallow. Panada was the gentle food of the tenderest patients, the newly born, the very old, the gravely weak, and it asked nothing of a body that could barely eat at all. It was among the humblest dishes a kitchen ever made, and among the kindest. Simpler still were the sops, pieces of bread soaked soft in something warm and comforting, in a little heated oil or wine, in broth, in milk with honey. A sop was the easiest of all foods to give and to take, soft and warm and already half a drink, and it slipped down where a bite of bread never could. To feed a weak patient a few warm sops, held to the lips a small piece at a time, was one of the simplest and commonest acts of the sick room, and one of the oldest comforts a household knew how to give. When strength was truly wanted, the household turned to broth, and to the restoring power of a long-simmered pot. A good broth, made from meat or fowl, and simmered gently for hours with a few herbs, drew the goodness of the whole into a clear, warm, nourishing liquid that a sick body could take when it could take nothing solid. The broth of a boiling fowl, what the old books call cock broth, held a particular fame as a restorer of the weak and the wasted, given to those recovering from a long illness to build them slowly back to strength. To set a broth simmering for an ailing family member was among the most natural and loving acts a household performed, and the smell of it, warm and savory, filling the house, was itself a kind of promise that care was being taken. For the households that kept the fasts of the church, or for the delicate stomach that could not bear the richness of milk, there was almond milk, one of the most valued of all the sick foods of the age, made by pounding blanched almonds and steeping them in water until the water grew white and rich. Almond milk was smooth, mild, and nourishing, and it kept where true milk would sour, and it broke no fast, and it sat kindly on the most delicate stomach, It went into gruels and pottages, and sweet dishes for the sick, and it was drunk on its own by the weak and the convalescent, and in the finer households especially. It was a mainstay of the whole sick-room kitchen, a gentle, keeping, blessed sort of food for the convalescent who needed rich and concentrated nourishment. The better households made jellies, above all the jelly boiled from calves' feet, long simmered until the liquid set firm and cool, then cleared and sweetened, and sometimes strengthened with a little wine. Such a jelly was thought to hold a great deal of goodness in a small, easy compass, and it was fed by the spoonful to those recovering from grave illness, a dainty, strengthening food for a body slowly finding its feet again. The cottage could not make such things, but it made its thin gruels and its broths to the same end, and the impulse behind both was one and the same. The household judged, in all of this, between two kinds of feeding, and judged well. In the heat of a fever it gave the thin and cooling things, the barley water and the light gruel, nothing to burden a body already laboring. As the fever broke and strength began to return, it turned to the nourishing and building things, the broths and the jellies and the richer gruels, coaxing the recovered appetite gently back toward ordinary food. To know which food belonged to which stage of an illness, when to cool and when to strengthen, was a real part of the household's healing wisdom, learned across a lifetime of tending the sick. Much of the art lay in tempting an appetite that illness had killed. A sick person must be coaxed to eat, and so the sick-room food was made small and dainty and pleasing, served warm in a clean bowl kept for the purpose, offered a little at a time so as not to dismay a weak stomach, sweetened and spiced to please where it could. A good nurse learned the small arts of persuasion, the tempting morsel, the favorite flavor, the patient offering and offering again, for a sick body that would not eat could not mend, and to get a few spoonfuls of broth into an unwilling patient was sometimes the whole victory of a long and anxious day. The vessels of this feeding were kept apart and cherished, as we saw when we spoke of the Caudle Cup, a particular bowl for the sick, a spoon, a covered dish to carry a warm broth up to the bedside without spilling. These lived with the sick-room things and came out whenever illness came into the house. Even the poorest home set aside some cup or bowl for the sick and washed it with special care. And in this small keeping, a part of a vessel, there was a kind of tenderness, a saying, without words, that the care of the ill was a thing set above the ordinary business of the day. For in the end, the feeding of the sick was the plainest expression of love the household had. To sit by a bed through a long night, to warm a broth and cool a gruel, to lift a weak head and hold a spoon to dry lips, to coax one more mouthful into a failing body, this was care in its simplest and truest form, and it was the same in the cottage and the castle, done by the same patient hands to the same patient end. The medicine shelf gave the salve and the syrup, but the broth pot gave the nourishment and the warmth and the loving attention, and of the two it was often the broth pot that did the deeper healing. Rich and poor met here as nowhere else. The great house made its calf's foot jelly, and its almond milk and its clear restoring broths, and the cottage made its thin oat gruel, and its bread sops and its cup of warm barley water, but the impulse behind both was identical, and identically old, to feed the sick something gentle and warm, and in the feeding to give them care. No lock divided this shelf, and no wealth commanded it. It belonged to everyone, and everyone reached for it. And it was, of all the household's medicine, the most universal and the most human. And the return of health was measured, always, at this same bowl. A sick person's mending was seen first in the appetite, in the day the broth was finished eagerly, the day a little solid food was asked for, the day the thin gruel gave way to something richer, and the patient sat up to take it. The household watched the sick bowl for these signs as closely as for any other, and there was no gladder moment in the whole of an illness than the one when the invalid, wan and thin, but mending at last, reached of their own will for the bowl and asked, quietly, for a little more. We have come to the end of the shelves now, and it is fitting that we end here, at the warm broth pot on the fire, for it holds the whole spirit of everything we have seen tonight. All the crocks and bundles and flasks, all the honey and vinegar and herbs, all the salves and syrups and charms, came down in the end to this, a warm bowl carried to a bedside by a caring hand, in the small hours by the light of a low fire. Let us gather the whole of the evening up now, and let it settle, and let ourselves settle with it, towards sleep. We have wandered, tonight, through the whole quiet medicine of an ordinary home. We began at the shelf by the hearth, and took down the crock of honey and the vinegar jug beside it. We looked up at the herb bundles drying in the rafters, and opened the salt box and the spice pouch, the pot of soft fat, and its little crocks of salve. We drew the stoppers from the small flasks of water and oil, warmed the Caudle Cup at the pot, and reached into the dark bag of roots and barks, and the little box of long, keeping seeds. We lifted the lid of the chest of cloths and bindings, glanced up at the charm above the door, and walked into the cool larder, where all of it was kept. We climbed from the Burgher's locked cupboard in the town to the deep stores of the Yeoman's farmhouse, and down again to the cottager's single bare shelf, and we ended, as every household ended, at the warm broth pot on the fire. There is nothing in all of it that you need to remember. Not a single crock, not a single herb, not a single remedy. It was only ever meant to be a slow, warm walk through an old and gentle world, a house at night with a low fire, and a full shelf and a family sleeping soundly under a well-kept roof. The names may fade as you drift, and that is exactly as it should be. Let them go. Let the whole quiet shelf fade softly into the dark. Let the day you carried in with you fall away now, spoonful by spoonful, the way a fever falls away under patient care. Let your body grow heavy and warm, as though wrapped in the softest of that worn old linen. Let your breathing slow to the steady rhythm of a house settling for the night, the fire banked low, the crocks all stoppered, the door barred, the charm keeping its quiet watch above it. There is nothing left to do. The shelf is full. The broth is warm on the fire. The whole long store of an ordinary home stands ready in the dark, asking nothing of you at all, and you may rest now as completely as any tended sleeper in any quiet cottage, safe and warm and wholly at ease. Sleep well. The Quiet Apothecary will be back soon, with another quiet chapter. Somewhere in the dark a low fire settles, and a last crock is set gently back upon its shelf, and the long, warm silence of the sleeping house closes softly over everything, and over you until morning.